Di Assalamualaikum Pak Dedi, Pak Arik.
Waalaikumsalam.
Waalaikumsalam, Pak Mahmud. Gambarnya belum ada, Pak Mahmud.
Assalamualaikum, selamat pagi. Pak Arik, Pak Dedi.
Oh, Pak Edi. Waalaikumsalam, Pak Edi.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Untuk teman-teman yang virtual background-nya ada di kolom chatting juga bisa di Pak Edi ya. Pak Mahmud, monggo.
Baik, kita akan mulai segera ya Pak dan Ibu.
Baik.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi dan salam sejahtera. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya. Yang terhormat Sekretaris Direktorat Jenderal Kekayaan Negara Kemenkeu Bapak Dedi Syarif Usman, Direktur Penilaian DJKN Kemenkeu Bapak Arik Haryono, Direktur Neraca Produksi Badan Pusat Statistik Bapak Puji Agus Kurniawan, Direktur Utama Badan Pengelola Dana Lingkungan Hidup Bapak Joko Triharyanto. Selamat datang di webinar Natural Capital Accounting for the Value of Nature in Indonesia atau Neraca Sumber Daya Alam Menghitung Nilai Alam di Indonesia. Webinar ini akan membahas pentingnya menghitung nilai sumber daya alam di Indonesia dan bagaimana hal tersebut dalam kontribusi dalam pembangunan berkelanjutan. Menjelang hari lahir Pancasila tanggal 1 Juni besok, sebuah kehormatan bagi kita untuk bersama mengamalkan Pancasila dengan menunjukkan persatuan dan mengambil langkah menuju musyawarah sesuai sila ketiga dan 4 Pancasila yang dilambangkan oleh burung Garuda yang ada di belakang kita saat ini. Webinar ini memiliki 3 tujuan utama. Pertama, memfasilitasi diskusi tentang perkembangan baru dalam neraca sumber daya alam yang digunakan secara internasional. Kedua, memahami peluang neraca sumber daya alam di Indonesia. Dan ketiga, mengumpulkan masukan untuk menyiapkan workshop dan pelatihan lanjutan. Acara ini akan dibuka oleh Bapak Dedi Syarif Usman selaku Sekretaris Direktorat Jenderal Kekayaan Negara dan dilanjutkan oleh sesi presentasi dan diskusi. Sesi presentasi terdiri atas 2 presentasi dari Stephanie Onder dan juga Robert Smith. Setelah presentasi akan ada sesi tanya jawab dan juga diskusi termoderasi oleh Bapak Hari Sutarmin. Dan panelisnya juga diwakili dari Kementerian Keuangan, BPS, dan BPDLH. Kemudian penutupan akan disampaikan oleh Bapak Civik Kachan selaku ekonom senior dari Bank Dunia. Untuk memulai acara, izinkan saya mengundang Bapak Sesditjen untuk memberikan sambutan dengan sebuah pantun. Jalan-jalan ke pedalaman, mengagumi alam bersama DJKN. Kepada Bapak Dedi Syarif Usman, waktu dan tempat kami persilakan.
Baik, terima kasih Mbak Nariswari. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning. Greetings of excellence and may peace be with every one of us. Dear distinguished guests and colleagues, first of all, I welcome you to this seminar as we came together to discuss a topic of utmost importance. Natural capital, accounting for the value of nature in Indonesia. The representative of the Director General of State Asset Management, I stand here today to deliver a short opening remark about the importance of developing natural capital to show the true worth of our nation. Indonesia is blessed with an abundance of diverse ecosystems, mineral resources, forests, oceans, and biodiversity that constitute our precious natural heritage. In our pursuit of economic progress and development, we must recognize the value of our natural capital. These resources are not merely commodities to be exploited. They are very foundation of our nation's prosperity and well-being. They are a vital and integral part of our nation's economy. To unlock the true value of our nation, we must utilize the power of natural capital accounting. By integrating the value of our ecosystem, biodiversity, and natural economic, social, and environmental significance, this holistic approach reveals the true worth of our nation. Furthermore, after knowing the value, the worth, and their economic, social, and environmental significance, we will be incorporating natural capital accounting into our policy development processes. Particularly, we are on the Ministry of Finance seek to incorporate natural capital accounting with fiscal policy to enable us to make informed decisions, ensuring that our fiscal policies align with our goals of sustainable development. Ladies and gentlemen, the development of our natural capital demands collaboration, innovation, and foresight. It requires the involvement of multiple stakeholders, from government agencies, private sectors, to local communities, working hand in hand towards a shared vision of a prosperous and sustainable Indonesia. As part of our efforts to pursue this sincere vision, with the World Bank in collaboration with the Ministry of Finance, Indonesia Statistic, and stakeholder participated today, bringing you a seminar on natural capital. Let us engage in thoughtful discussion and explore ideas for future natural capital. I convey my wishes for the success of this seminar. May it be a platform for meaningful dialogue, collaboration, and the findings of new insight for a better Indonesia. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih banyak Bapak Dedi. Sungguh sebuah sambutan yang sangat hangat, dan selanjutnya presentasi pertama akan disampaikan oleh Ibu Stephanie Onder. Stephanie Onder adalah ekonom senior di Bank Dunia yang saat ini memimpin kajian The Changing Wealth of Nations. Beliau memiliki pengalaman riset dengan fokus ekonomi pembangunan dan lingkungan. Beliau juga menyandang gelar PhD di bidang ekonomi di London School of Economics. Kepada Ibu Stephanie Onder, waktu dan tempat kami persilakan.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at the seminar today. I hope you can see the slides. I have to say Indonesia has a very special place in my heart because my PhD thesis was on deforestation in Indonesia. And I spent many years staring at the Indonesian forest and trying to understand what was driving its changes. And that has led me to the World Bank and ultimately has led me to this work. So I am here today to share with you the World Bank's work on the changing wealth of nations. And I wanted to give you a brief overview of what I will be discussing today. Natural capital accounting, as you know, is an integral part of wealth accounting, which tries to essentially produce a balance sheet for a country, which will look at produced capital, human capital, and most importantly, natural capital. And I wanted to start out by trying to explain to you, and I'm sure that's familiar to many participants, why we feel that wealth is a very important complementary metric to GDP to tell us about a country's economic progress, and most importantly, to what extent that progress is sustainable. And then I wanted to share with you how we are doing wealth accounting at the World Bank. That is, of course, global level data, since we're trying to produce a database that can allow us to compare more than 160 countries, of which, of course, Indonesia is an important one. But this global data can hopefully provide some insights on how you can do data and produce it bottom up using Indonesian data and perhaps using and leveraging some of the global models and analysis we've done. And then I also wanted to share with you the work that we are currently pioneering on natural capital accounting for the next edition of the Changing Wealth of Nations. The last one came out in 2021, and we are working very hard to get the next edition out by the end of this calendar year. So that's what we're working towards. And then I wanted to conclude. So I just wanted to give you a very brief motivation of why we care about this topic, and I hope you find this useful. And this is really in this broader context, and this is a discussion that's been going on for a long time, that people feel GDP, which is really the yardstick we all use to measure economic progress, is not fully sufficient. And this is widely recognized across the globe. Most recently, the UN Secretary General, in his vision of for the world, has called GDP a glaring blind spot, and has started an initiative which actually just came out, I think just a few days ago. It's a brief on valuing what counts that outlines a framework of how we could move beyond GDP. This is a contribution of the whole UN system, and the World Bank was part of the technical process to develop it. And it's essentially trying to say, okay, we know GDP has its disadvantages and its limitations, and what other measurement frameworks can we use? This is a similar call that was echoed by the G7, not only by the environment ministers, where, you know, you would not be surprised for such a call, but these are actually the science and technology ministers you can see in that image down there. And also, of course, leading academics have been calling for this for a long time, most notably, of course, the Dasgupta review that came out recently. But of course, the big question is, where will we go? What kind of indicators are we looking at? And of course, when we do this, we need to keep, you know, stakeholders like you and my decision makers who sit in ministries of finance and planning and need to make a decision. So what we want is a measure that is useful and usable, right? And for that to happen, we need something that is precise and concise. Do we want another 90 plus indicators like the SDG that countries have to go to monitor? Or are we looking for something very concise, like an index, like, for instance, this multidimensional vulnerability index we're thinking about? And we want something that's actionable. Of course, on the one hand, we are interested in the big questions, social progress, human welfare, you know, the big ticket items that we think determine human well-being. But we also need to make decisions about taxes. We need to make decisions about price stability, jobs, productivity, creditworthiness. And these are all slightly more mundane tasks, but, you know, we also want to have information that can help us inform those decisions. And then, of course, we need to have something that is robust from a theoretical and empirical point of view, and something that can be repeatedly produced to help inform decision-making, not only once, but continually. And that ultimately takes us back to the system of national accounts and its extension, the system of environmental economic accounting. We know that we have a system of statistical agencies across the world that are using those systems to produce macroeconomic indicators. And of course, ideally, we want to produce an indicator that is generated as part of this broad system of data production. And so when you think about what we're currently measuring, I wanted to show you this slide. This is from Eli Fenichel. I need to give him full credit. He has developed this slide, but I find it really useful. Because if we think about what is GDP really measuring and what information can it really inform? There's a lot going on this slide, but the main idea is, I don't know if you can see my cursor is, the question is, what do people really care about? In the simplest form, it's consumption, right? It's the products we consume, it's the products we purchase. And these are made by production, which is ultimately what GDP measures. And production is produced with produced capital, stuff that we have made, and of course with people. And this indicator, GDP, was initially designed to measure that production as we produce it year for year, and then you can use it to inform your tax base, price stability, jobs, productivity, etc. So this is the framework that we have currently used to develop. And how Eli has so nicely put it, that he made this picture of this one-eyed owl, which he's saying, this gives us some sense of the direction that the economy is going, but it only gives us a partial view, which is why one of the eyes of the owl is closed. What is missing is the purple bars. The economic production doesn't only depend on produced capital. It doesn't only depend on labor, but it does depend also on natural capital, our climate, our environment, our nature. They directly feed in our production and are impacted by it. They directly impact the things we care about. Leisure, for instance, homemade goods, if you think about the tomatoes I'm growing in my backyard, etc. They also impact people, our health, our education, our general well-being, which from the recent COVID crisis, we all know there is a clear interaction between the environment and our health, which ultimately impact labor, as well as the things we care about, our family. We all realize how challenging it is to work and do daycare, for instance, at the same time. So if we really want to have an understanding of the whole economy, a full-eyed view, we shouldn't only think about the immediate things that GDP is measuring, but all the assets that are contributing to production, which ultimately takes us to a wealth-based approach and allows us to have a clear-eyed view of the economy. And so this is really our motivation to say GDP is useful. It can definitely answer important questions, but it cannot answer all. And so now what the World Bank has done literally since the 1990s is to try to produce such a wealth-based metric. We call it comprehensive wealth. And it has a lot of things that are pretty straightforward to measure and some that are much harder to measure. So the straightforward thing is, of course, produced capital, our machines, our structures, urban land. We have data for it. We have market transactions for it. We can record the crisis and measure it. Then there's this whole bar here, which is natural capital. Some of it, again, is easy to measure. Non-renewables. We know how much oil we're pumping out of the ground, how many minerals, for how much money we're selling them. Same for the crops we produce, the timber we extract, the fish we catch. Those we can all measure and we can put them on the balance sheet easily. But there are other things that are much harder, especially once we move into the realm of ecosystem services and protected areas. And so a lot of the focus of this initiative has been to measure those aspects of wealth better, because as you all know, what we do not measure, we cannot manage. And so a large focus of this initiative has been to expand that green bar. And then, of course, another key component of wealth is human capital. This is all of us, our education, our experience, our contributions as a labor force, and this can be measured by lifetime earnings and then our net foreign assets. And so the World Bank has been producing this in this series called The Changing Wealth of Nations. There have been 4 editions, and we're now in the middle of updating the last one. And the whole idea is to try to produce that balance sheet, to produce that complementary metric to GDP that is comparable across countries and over time. That is the whole idea. And in doing that, to make sure we are as theoretically and empirically robust as we can be with the global database, we're trying to use the methodologies of the SNA and the SIA, the standards, as well as any emerging guidelines that are coming out to make sure we're at the cutting edge. And so now what I thought might be useful for you is to just give you a sense of what you can do with this data, and of course with this particular focus on the natural capital data, just to give you a sense of what kind of decisions can be informed. Of course, the big one is the headline indicator, which is changes in wealth per capita, which is in a way, from a theoretical point of view, an equivalent to measuring changes in human well-being. This is a map of the world using the data from the last report. And essentially, as long as changes in wealth per capita are not declining, but at least increasing over time, we can be sure that future generations will have at least the same set of consumption possibilities as we have today, so that we are at least sustainable, so that they can have the same production and consumption choices. They have at least as many enough wealth per capita at their hands. And as you can see, Indonesia is definitely amongst the countries that has experienced a growth in its change in wealth per capita over that time period. And I'm sure our update will show a very similar effect. And so that is very important because it shows us that Indonesia is not only growing, but that growth is sustainable. You will see a couple of countries that are shaded in light and dark red. Those are countries that have experienced declines in their wealth per capita over time. These are countries that are very low income. These are countries that are in conflict, but also countries that are very dependent on non-renewable natural resources and are not using those rents that they generate from those non-renewables to reinvest them in other forms of capital. But of course, the headline figure is only so useful because it tells you where we're going. But what we also then want to know is what is driving those changes over time. And I wanted to, oh, sorry, there's a bit of an echo. I hope you can hear me fine. That shows how, for Indonesia in particular, the different components of wealth have grown over time. And what is very important here, what you can see, is that in particular over this time period, human capital has increased tremendously over this time period. And that is very common across most countries, but in particular middle-income countries. And we have delved into the data, and this is really driven by the growth in the human capital share of men in particular, of the male working labor force. Their lifetime earnings have grown over time. You can also see there has been a continuous increase in produced capital, and natural, non-renewable natural capital, has steadily increased as well, but not at the same extent. And just to show you how these trends are similar across other middle-income countries, human capital is generally the largest share of global wealth. In Indonesia, it's around 54%. On average, it's kind of more around 2/3. So that is very similar. And this has particularly been driven, this growth over time in middle income countries, because labor income has been growing and because people have higher educational attainments. So for instance, here you can see a chart of the annual growth rate of human capital, and especially upper and lower middle income countries have really experienced that growth because there are more gains to be made from education. There has been growth in wage growth rates. And here again, you see particularly the South Asia and the East Asia and Pacific region have really reaped in those benefits. And this is exactly what we also find when we dig deep in the Indonesia data. Then, of course, the other key part we care about, which is why we're here today, is natural capital per capita. And as you can see as well, natural capital per capita has grown over time. And I have broken it down by its components to give you the trend over time, as well as the snapshot for 2018. And I wanted to draw your attention to two main trends. One is that the growth of croplands, this big yellow slice, has grown tremendously over time. And this is really largely driven by the increased value in production that is coming from croplands. And then the other big share is the fossil fuels and the minerals, where you see there is a large boom here around the commodity boom, but overall, again, that share has grown over time. And this is, again, something that we find. Some of that volatility was due to the global commodity price boom that you all know about, of course. And you can see this when you disentangle the data. So if you look at how wealth, for instance, for fossil fuel has grown, the largest increase was due to prices, but also to increases in production and some, rediscoveries, and then, of course, a decline in costs. And all of those have led to increases in growth. And then, of course, the other one, especially if you then break it down by middle income countries, and especially if you dig into the data for Indonesia again, you see that part of this is driven by the commodity boom, and a lot of it is also driven by increases in production, which I understand in Indonesia is both around coal in particular, as well as certain minerals. So that is really what is behind these numbers. The last thing I wanted to share with you is really now how you go about measuring these, which is probably what is most interesting for you in the context of this seminar. So I wanted to share how you go about producing these numbers. And I know the Indonesian Statistical Office is doing a lot of this already. But essentially, how we generally try to approach measuring the asset value of natural capital, whether it's renewable or non-renewable, is literally to try to use a residual value method, where you essentially try to estimate. You take the operating surplus and you take all the operating expenditure costs and the fixed costs out of it to isolate the resource rent that is accruing to your particular resource. And then you compute the net present value, which, if it's an exhaustible resource, you do over its time horizon that it's available. And for renewables, as long as they are sustainably managed for about 100 years. And what is very useful if you have that resource rent data is that you can actually then go ahead and use it for decision making. And I wanted to share with you a few examples. So one thing, of course, is that once you have these resource rents computed for your different resources, you can use them to inform sectoral policies. So for instance, there is a recent initiative by the World Bank in Nepal, where they have tried to estimate the resource rents from the forestry sector and use that to design a revenue sharing mechanism between the central government and the local government. There is information, for instance, in the Philippines, where they have used the resource rent for minerals to inform their tax policies. The water accounts in Botswana, for instance, have been used for pricing, but you can also use them for macroeconomic policies. For instance, for debt ratings is the future. I wanted to share with you this chart here for Kazakhstan, where they were looking at, and this is a figure from an IMF report, where they were looking at the net operating balance, which, makes Kazakhstan look pretty good. But if you account for natural resource depletion in that particular country context, their situation is actually considerably much worse. So once you take these into account, especially if you manage your natural resources right, it can have important implications for instance, something like debt ratings. And then, of course, lastly, and I understand that for many of the policymakers in the room, that's a key question, is, so what does the future hold? What happens if I pursue a particular policy? And at that point, of course, you want to use this data on assets in particular and try to do scenario analysis. And the last Changing Wealth of Nations report, for instance, has tried to do scenario analysis on the low carbon energy transition to observe how prices for oil, asset values for oil, gas, and coal will change under different climate change policy scenarios, whether we have cooperation or whether we have unilateral action with the border carbon adjustment mechanism, etc. And so for that, of course, you need to use models, but to be able to run these models, you need baseline asset data, and that is what the accounts can provide. So the use of this data ranges from really informing a specific sectoral policy to helping you design, broader macroeconomic development policies. Then the last piece I wanted to share with you is, of course, when you go into ecosystem services, it gets more challenging. You typically need geospatial data. You typically need valuation approaches, and many of those are experimental. So, for instance, one that we have done in the last Changing Wealth of Nations report is to add the services provided by Mangroves in terms of their shoreline protection services. In terms of the avoided damages. I don't know if you can see this picture very well, but the idea is that if you have a mangrove, it stops the waves coming in and protects the people and the assets behind it. And you can basically model the threat of flooding and how much flooding is avoided by having those mangroves. And so, for instance, this is our most recent updated data that will go in the report, where you can see the changes in mangrove area over time. Many countries experienced a decline early on. So I don't know if you can see this. This year is Indonesia. There was a large decline up to between 1996 and 2010. And then this has slowed considerably as mangrove conservation efforts have increased. And of course, with that, the annual expected benefits have gone up a lot of flood protection. And so you see Indonesia here, for instance, is increasing. We have very high values, especially for higher income in China, for instance, and then higher income countries like, the United States and Australia. And so this is really the kind of information you can develop with these models that you can then use to help inform zoning. You can help inform disaster risk management policies. You can help inform insurance premia for those assets that are protected or not by the mangroves. So this data, again, has very, very specific applications. This modeling work is involved, and so this is generally global level data that can be used to approximate country conditions. But of course, with country level data, this can be considerably improved, particularly if we have good country level data on the spatial distribution of people and assets. I think that is a major step. Another one I wanted to share with you that we have done is looking at non-wood forest ecosystem services, which are, of course, extremely important. This is modeling work done by the IUCN, where they have GIS data and where they kind of do this huge analysis of all the academic literature out there that has tried to value ecosystem services, and then they kind of use a fancy prediction model, regressions, machine learning, to then come up with prediction of the value of ecosystem services across the world. And then you can say that for recreation, for non-wood forest products, water services, habitat, and then you start getting value estimates for the world around it. Of course, these estimates are based on global valuation studies. If there are specific studies for Indonesia, they've captured them as much as they can. Perhaps they don't have everything, but again, a similar approach can be done to refine these global estimates to come up with country-specific information that you can then use to inform a payment for ecosystem services program, debt for nature swaps, green finance, etc. So that is really how this data can ultimately be used. Lastly, I wanted to share with you the frontier we're at, because I thought these might be things that will be relevant for you to know what is coming and what the options are going forward to further expand this work. So these are the innovations that are coming to the global database. So first of all, we're again measuring comprehensive wealth in market exchange rates, but also in PPPs. We will also produce a volume-based index that is more capturing how the stocks are changing over time to kind of give us not only one map of the changes in wealth in dollar terms, but also in the underlying asset base. And then we're making a few key additions to renewable natural capital that I wanted to flag with you. The first one is renewable energy. This wasn't there before. There was a pilot done for the last Changing Wealth of Nations to look at solar, wind, hydropower, and geothermal. They've done it for 15 countries last time. Now we will scale it up to the world. This is a critical natural capital that is currently not on the balance sheets, but an approach has now been developed that has been accepted by the SNA community in the next update. This was done with the support of the Changing Wealth of Nations program. and actually Rob Smith, who will speak later today. And so this is one key resource that we're going to add. And then the other key ecosystem services we're trying to add is carbon retention. So this is essentially the carbon stored in all terrestrial land uses, whether it's agricultural land, whether it's forests, but also in mangroves. And I just wanted to briefly illustrate what this involves. We have literally, these are brand new estimates, so please bear with me, they're still draft. So this is, for instance, giving you changes in the carbon stock across the world as it has changed over time. We have similar figures for changes in the carbon stock in forest over the last 20 years. And so now the key challenge is, what does this tell us how these changes have changed over time? So here you can see, for instance, you can again see for Indonesia, the changes over time in the mangrove carbon stock. We have similar figures here. Sorry, this is very hard to see for Indonesia. That's the red line, how the carbon stored in forests has declined and changed over time. And so we have these carbon stock estimates, and now we want to put them on the balance sheet. And that is where the challenges are happening. We need to think about what price we are using. Are we using a market price, or are we using a shadow price, like a social cost for carbon? And should that have all market or non-market components? We need to think about, do we want to put on the balance sheet for each country only the country-specific benefits? And what do we do about the global public good, the global benefits? And then how can we include this new asset and not cause double counting as we add this up, since, of course, some of these values are already incorporated in asset values we currently have. We're still working through these issues with the guidance from the UN Statistics Division and experts in the field of environmental economic accounting. But I just wanted to flag these to you that while it is important to keep expanding ecosystem services, and particularly carbon will be a game changer for forest-rich countries like Indonesia, like Canada, like Brazil. But the key challenge is we want to get it right of how we're adding it. And then very lastly, and I promise I conclude with this last slide, is I just wanted to kind of wrap up by saying that we do feel a complementary metric to GDP is needed, because all that GDP tells us whether growth is occurring, but wealth per capita can tell us whether that growth is sustainable. So I think that is really where we feel we should be heading. Of course, there are other indicators that can be used alongside GDP, but we feel that countries, just like people, households, and firms, should be judged by both their income stream and their asset base. We do want to point out that measuring wealth per capita is a very challenging exercise. I've been doing this for the last 2 years, and I can assure you it is very time and resource intensive. We will never be able to be comprehensive. I think we need to be aware of that. We can add more assets and need to think about which ones we should use. So that is key. But natural capital is absolutely critical, but it can be very challenging. The low-hanging fruit is, natural capital that is traded in markets, and I know many of these Indonesia is already measuring. Minerals, fossil fuels, timber, capture fisheries is already challenging, renewable energy, etc. The non-market natural capital, especially ecosystem services, can be measured, but there especially valuation is challenging. There is no clear international guidance on it yet. I don't think this should discourage us from doing it, because especially once you make this spatial, it's extremely useful, not only for the accounts, but for policy more generally. But I think this is something where we just need to be aware that we are literally at the frontier and that we're producing experimental estimates. And then I think the last thing I wanted to point out is that really the inclusion of human capital is equally critical and possible. I know this is very hard. We are doing this bottom up using labor force surveys and producing Menserian coefficients and then the labor income of the labor force. But given the large share it has in wealth, it is an important component to measure. And I just wanted to mention this, despite the focus today, that this is a critical component that is deserving a lot of attention. So at this point, I wanted to thank you very much, Terima kasih, for giving me time to speak. Look forward to your questions and our discussion. And if you would like any further information on the last report, the data we have produced, I've included the link here for your information. So thank you very much, and I stop sharing. Thank you.
Terima kasih banyak Stephanie atas presentasinya. Jadi tadi sudah kita saksikan paparan tentang beberapa keterbatasan dari GDP dan bagaimana kita tidak bisa mengelola yang tidak kita ukur. Jadi itu bisa jadi pemantik untuk diskusi sesi selanjutnya ya. Dan untuk tanya jawab nanti akan menggunakan fitur raise hand, tapi jika rekan-rekan punya pertanyaan bisa juga melalui kolom chat. Nanti akan diterjemahkan ke bahasa Inggris agar bisa dijawab. Dan untuk selanjutnya kami bermaksud untuk mengundang Rob Smith sebagai presenter kedua. Rob Smith adalah seorang ahli statistik dan ekonom lingkungan yang dikenal atas karya konkretnya dalam menghubungkan diskursus lingkungan dan ekonomi. Rob memiliki 20 tahun bekerja di Statistics Kanada atau Badan Pusat Statistik Kanada, di mana beliau turut berkontribusi dalam membangun program neraca lingkungan. Dan sejak tahun 2013, Rob mendirikan Midsummer Analytics, sebuah biro konsultasi yang fokus pada analisis ekonomi lingkungan. Sekali lagi terima kasih banyak Stephanie, dan kepada Rob Smith, waktu dan tempat kami persilakan.
Great. Thank you very much, Neris, for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. So can it be seen right now? Yeah, good. Wonderful. And let me just start my presentation. Good. All right. Well, first of all, let me say thank you to the World Bank, to David Katchen and Neris for this opportunity to speak to you all today. It's a topic that I am very passionate about and that I've been working on for a long time now. I've had the pleasure to work on it recently with Stephanie Onder, who we just heard from the World Bank, and with lots of other colleagues as well, including colleagues at the International Institute for Sustainable Development here in Canada. And I'd like to acknowledge the contributions that they've made to the work that I'm going to talk about. So much of what I'm going to say will echo what we just heard from Stephanie. So I'm going to talk about moving beyond GDP by adopting measures of comprehensive wealth. And I'm going to talk about why that, I think, puts countries in a better place for decision making than they are today, where there is excessive reliance on just GDP. So what's wrong with relying just on GDP? Well, there's nothing wrong with it in particular if we use GDP as it was intended to be used, and that is as a simple measure of the size of the economy. And Stephanie showed us that nicely in the figure that she shared with us from Eli Fenichel. The problem is that GDP over time has become used for a lot more than it was intended originally. So today we find ourselves in a situation where politicians, investors, business people, the public in general use GDP every day essentially as the judge of national success. So if GDP is growing in a country, then generally speaking, that's good news, and people will agree that things are going in the right direction. And if GDP is declining, then that's bad news, and people will say something needs to change. But this is not really true. The story is much more complex than that. And the story that GDP tells is a story that is told by Stephanie's one-eyed owl. And what we really want is a two-eyed owl, not a one-eyed owl. But today we give too much attention to this one-eyed owl, which is GDP. And that leads decision makers to focus on short-term economic benefits, even if those short-term benefits undermine well-being in the long run by degrading the environment, by allowing the climate to change so that we get increasingly destructive weather, and so on and so on. So really what we have today is an over-reliance, almost an addiction to GDP, and it has quite a lot of negative consequences for decision-making. So really, the time has come for the world to move beyond GDP. And it's not just me saying that, it's not just colleagues at the World Bank saying that, there's lots of people calling for it. Back in 2018, when the G7 heads met in Canada, they acknowledged that GDP is insufficient for measuring success. Stephanie has already mentioned the UN Secretary General's interest in moving beyond GDP, and also the work that's been done by Professor Dasgupta at Cambridge on measuring the economics of biodiversity. And in fact, in Indonesia last September, I was lucky enough to be part of a G20 seminar in which the final communique also called for countries to move beyond GDP. So Indonesia is in fact making already a good contribution to the case for moving beyond GDP. So the question is, what lies beyond GDP? If we're going to move beyond GDP, where are we headed? And I think part of the answer to that question rests in admitting that wherever we go beyond GDP, we're not going to leave GDP entirely behind. It's too useful for its intended purpose. There's too many decisions that rest upon it today. It's too deeply embedded in decision-making processes. Plus, GDP has some very nice features that make it useful for decision-making. So for one, it is conceptually robust. It's based on a long history of development in economics. For another, it's concise. It sums up a lot of information in just a few numbers. It's measured consistently, frequently, and widely. So that makes it very useful for comparing progress between countries. And honestly, it is relevant to the concerns of many people. GDP measures income, and income does matter to people. So wherever beyond GDP is, it has to be better than GDP alone, and it also has to make room for GDP to come along for the journey. So there are a variety of possibilities that are being explored today as means of moving beyond GDP. Three that are particularly popular are well-being indicator dashboards. So these are large dashboards of indicators that include sometimes dozens of indicators that are focused on a variety of determinants of well-being. They're quite popular because they're large and therefore they cover a lot of material. But because they're large, they can be cumbersome for decision making, and they're not always very conceptually clear, these large indicator dashboards. Another possibility are the multi-dimensional indexes that have been developed in various places around the world. One of the most popular of these indexes is the UN Development Programme's Human Development Index, which has been measured now for many years. More recently, in the Arab region, there's an index that is called the Development Challenges Index that has been proposed. These indexes are I think, better than multidimensional indicator dashboards because they're more concise. And often it's a little bit easier to understand exactly what it is that they're getting at, but they're also not always as conceptually clear as they should be. So that brings us to the third approach that is generally considered in this debate around moving beyond GDP, which are expanded measures of wealth. For example, the kinds of wealth measures that Stephanie was talking about from the World Bank's Changing Wealth of Nations report. And there's a similar report from the United Nations Environment Program called the Inclusive Wealth Report that also measures essentially expanded national wealth. Expanded national wealth measures are nice because they're concise and they're also conceptually clear. So my personal view and the view of people at the World Bank and UNEP and elsewhere is that these expanded wealth measures represent the best pathway for moving beyond GDP. So let's talk about these expanded wealth measures in a little bit more detail. So first of all, let's talk about what wealth is and how it is different from income. So wealth is essentially what you possess. It might be a car, it might be a home, it might be some money that you have saved in the bank, or it could be the skills and knowledge that you have as a worker. So those are all things that you can own and that you can benefit from through ownership. Income, on the other hand, is what you earn using your wealth. So income can come in the form of a salary that you might get by selling your skills and knowledge to an employer. Income might also come from interest that you earn off of your savings, or perhaps from investments in the stock market, or it might come in the form of profits when you sell a house. So it's important to understand that wealth and income are related, and wealth is in fact the basis of income. So without wealth, there can't be any income. So wealth matters then because it is the basis of income. It is what matters in the long run. So what matters in the long run for the well-being of a nation is not what income is today. Rather, what matters is what wealth is today, because wealth today determines income tomorrow. So both income and wealth are important, but it's only measures of wealth that help us understand and plan for the future. And that's why measuring comprehensive wealth and assets is so important from a policy perspective. So what is comprehensive wealth? And here I'm going to very much repeat much of what was said in Stephanie's presentation. So comprehensive wealth comprises 5 different stocks of assets. The first is what we call produced capital. This is things like buildings and roads and factories. The second is natural capital, the subject of today's seminar. And that includes healthy ecosystems and abundant resources. Then we have human capital, which is made up of productive, well-educated citizens. And then financial capital, things like stocks and bonds. And then finally, social capital, which is the cooperative relationships that we have amongst one another and that are built on trust. And together, these 5 categories of capital make up what I like to call the comprehensive wealth portfolio. And it's important to realize that every country has assets in each of the components of this portfolio. So every country has some produced capital, every country has natural capital, and so on and so on. But different countries have different amounts of each of these asset types in their portfolio. And different countries make different decisions about how to manage those portfolios as well. So why should countries measure comprehensive wealth? Well, first and foremost, because governments everywhere on the planet today don't pay enough attention to wealth. And remember, I said a moment ago that it is wealth that matters in the long run. Income may be important in the short term, but it's wealth that matters in the long run. But because we focus so much on measuring GDP and using GDP to drive decisions, the short-term focus of income, the short-term focus of GDP, therefore leads decision makers also to focus on short-term measures. And yet citizens everywhere in Indonesia and Canada and everywhere else are all dependent on wealth for their prosperity and well-being in the long run. So we really should, as countries, be measuring wealth and reporting on wealth alongside GDP. But the fact is, we aren't doing that right now. So some of the advantages of using comprehensive wealth measures as measures of progress is that comprehensive wealth is relatively simple to understand, based on sound theory. It's easy for citizens to understand wealth because it's real to them. They can see wealth around them all the time in their homes and their personal health and skills and relations and so on. And also, it's important to recognize that every business tracks both wealth and income. So it's not that that wealth is not given attention in decision making. It's just that governments don't give it enough attention in decision making. Businesses track both wealth and income, and governments should do the same. So there is some work that has been done around the world to measure comprehensive wealth. With my colleagues at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, we have prepared 2 reports for measuring comprehensive wealth in Canada, one in 2016 and one in 2018. And we are currently compiling similar reports for Ethiopia, Trinidad and Tobago, and also with colleagues in Indonesia. So we're working on a report on comprehensive wealth for Indonesia at the moment. In the United States, the government has recently announced that it is going to add natural capital to its national balance sheet. In the United Kingdom, the Statistics Office is measuring comprehensive wealth. I mentioned already the fact that the G20 in Indonesia last year called for countries to measure comprehensive wealth. The Pakistani government has commissioned a report on the topic, and it's being measured in New Zealand as well. So there are efforts around the world to measure comprehensive wealth, although they're not as widespread as they should be. I want to show you some of the results from the work that I've done with my colleagues in Canada, and I want to talk a little bit about why we think these results are so important for understanding the sustainability of well-being in Canada. So what we found is that comprehensive wealth in Canada hardly grew between 1980 and 2015. So there was very little growth, only 0.23% annually in comprehensive wealth over that 35-year time period. And what was particularly worrisome to us was that human capital, which is, as Stephanie said, the most important component of comprehensive wealth in pretty much all countries, that human capital didn't grow at all in Canada over that time period. And it's still a puzzle to us why that is the case, but it is true that human capital has not grown or did not grow in Canada over that time period. Natural capital declined over the time period, and the other assets grew, but only slightly. Now, what's interesting is that even though comprehensive wealth barely grew over that time period, consumption, as measured by GDP, grew very rapidly during that time period. So we had growth of comprehensive wealth of only 0.23% annually, whereas consumption, or GDP, grew at 1.3% annually. So this is not sustainable in the long run. You can't have continually growing consumption without having your wealth grow at something like the same rate. Remember, I said that wealth is the basis for income. So if income is growing faster than wealth, that must mean that wealth is being eroded over time. And that's exactly what we think is happening in Canada. So we, as I've already mentioned, Canada's human capital didn't grow at all over the time period. The produced capital assets in the country we found to be overly concentrated in housing, stocks, and fossil fuel extraction. Financial capital is increasingly weighed down by household debt and weak savings rates. And it turns out that Canadian households after the pandemic are now the most indebted in the G7, which is a disappointing result. Social capital in Canada appears to be holding steady, but the pressures on social capital, as in all countries, are great. And natural capital is declining rapidly in Canada. So there's plenty of reason to be concerned about the sustainability of well-being in Canada in the long run. But that message of concern for sustainability is certainly not told if one looks only at GDP in Canada. So in other words, if one is a one-eyed owl and only looks at GDP, then the story of Canada's progress is quite positive. But a two-eyed owl, or a clear-eyed owl, as Stephanie called it, would see that there are actually considerable threats to Canada's well-being in the long run. But that's only clear if we look at comprehensive wealth as well as GDP. So the truth is that Statistics Canada, the National Statistics Office, could easily start reporting on comprehensive wealth. It has all of the data that it needs to do so, but the demand has to come first from the policy side of government. And so far, that demand is not coming. Instead, Canada is proposing to use one of these large and cumbersome indicator dashboards that I talked about. So my view is that Indonesia should avoid going down the path that Canada is going. And in fact, it should focus on complementing GDP by measuring comprehensive wealth. And in fact, it looks very much like Indonesia is moving in the right direction in that regard. And I'll say a few more words on that later in the presentation. I just wanted to show you a few examples of natural capital accounting in some other countries, just to show you that there is good and interesting work being done. I should say that the efforts on natural capital accounting around the world are quite varied in terms of their focus. So it depends a lot on what form of natural capital is important in a country. In some places, the focus is on measuring market resources like minerals and timber and fossil fuels. In other countries, the focus is on measuring ecosystems. Sometimes the work is done in physical units. Sometimes it's done in monetary units. And sometimes it's done in using both. One of the good news stories is that most countries today, when they're compiling natural capital accounts, are following the UN accounting guidance on this topic. And that's quite important because we want these estimates to be compiled on the basis of complementary methodologies. So here's just one example of a physical account of natural capital. This is water flow accounting in Botswana. Botswana, of course, is quite a dry country, so it's natural that they would want to focus on understanding where their water is coming from and where it's going to. And one of the interesting things about this chart is all of these question marks down here at the bottom, which indicates that they're not entirely certain how much water is returned back to the environment from each of these sectors. So clearly they're able to compile some of the statistics that are required for this kind of an account, but not all of them. This is quite a different set of statistics from the statistical office in the Philippines, focusing on energy resources. So in particular on coal and oil and gas. So here in the Philippines, they provide data that are measured both in physical terms, but also in monetary terms. So they really have quite sophisticated accounts for mineral and energy resources. And some of this work, as Stephanie mentioned in her presentation, was actually started with funding from the World Bank. And it's really gratifying to see the Philippine Statistics Authority continuing down that path. Here is actually an example that I found from Indonesia's statistical office, BPS. This is some very interesting data on the physical quantities of timber of different types in different parts of Indonesia, showing some interesting results depending upon the type of timber and the part of the region of the country. So I just want to point out a couple of things about this chart. One is that it shows that the total timber resources of Indonesia are tracking downwards over time. So from 2014 to 2018, there was a decline of about 25% or so in terms of total timber resources, which I think is interesting, because if you look at the next chart, you can see that the value of those resources in rupees actually increased over time. So this gets back to a point that Stephanie was focusing on in her presentation about the way in which we measure the change over time in natural capital assets. This view of natural capital in physical terms shows a decline. This view in monetary terms shows an increase. So what we really want is a means of combining those two types of data, the monetary data and the physical data, that gives the proper signal about the sustainability of Indonesia's timber resources. And Stephanie alluded to this in her presentation about some work that I'm actually doing with her team at the World Bank to develop what we call a volume index of natural capital for countries that will, we hope, provide a better signal, a clearer signal of sustainability in the changing wealth of nations than was the case previously. So, although good progress is being made on natural capital accounting in Indonesia, in Canada, and in lots of other countries around the world, there are challenges that remain. It's too often the case that basic physical data on natural capital are missing. So when we go to place a value on natural assets in many countries, we often find that we simply can't even get the basic physical data. Where we can get the basic physical data, there are still often problems with valuation. So sometimes we are lacking some of the other data that we need for valuation. But sometimes it is simply the case that there are challenges in terms of concepts and methods for valuation. And this is particularly true of non-market ecosystem services. Another problem with the measurement of natural capital is that the data are often not very timely. So they're often quite old when they are released. And they're also not released very frequently. They're often released only annually or sometimes less frequently. And it's difficult to compete with GDP when GDP is released very frequently, once every quarter. And also in a very timely fashion. So GDP statistics are available very soon after the current quarter. So in some countries, efforts are actually being made to increase the frequency with which some environmental statistics are being released, so that we can begin to present citizens with environmental data of the same frequency and timeliness as economic data. And then finally, although national accounting standards are rapidly improving in terms of measuring natural capital, public and business accounting standards are not. So although the UN system of national accounts and system of environmental accounts is showing countries, excuse me, how to measure natural capital in the context of official statistics, government statistics and business statistics are lagging behind. And that's a problem, because we want to have natural capital measured not just by statistical agencies, but also by governments and by businesses. And that's why I'm so encouraged by the thinking that is going on in Indonesia right now in terms of the development of this new legislation to provide a better basis for measuring natural capital by government agencies in the country. There are, as I mentioned, a wide variety of national accounting standards already in place for natural capital. These are available from the United Nations Statistics Division, and countries that are embarking upon the measurement of natural capital are certainly encouraged to make use of this excellent set of international guidance documents that the UN has published. So just to begin to summarize, if countries want to promote natural capital accounting and enhance their sustainability, what should they do? Well, really, I think what they should do is begin to measure comprehensive wealth and measure natural capital as a component of comprehensive wealth. Because when we measure natural capital as a component of comprehensive wealth, we really put natural capital into that broader context where we understand its importance along with the other assets that contribute to overall well-being in a country. So all countries should do this. I would encourage Indonesia to begin doing it as well. But of course, it's not enough to just measure comprehensive wealth and natural capital. We also need to design policies to better balance short-term objectives with long-run prosperity. And again, I was very encouraged to hear in the opening remarks this morning that Indonesia intends to do exactly that, to use natural capital data to design new policies. And that's extremely gratifying and encouraging to hear that. So just to close, I would say that Indonesia is in fact ahead of many countries on the transition beyond GDP. We've just heard that there's a plan to use natural capital data to change policy making, which is wonderful. The country already has a strong engagement with the G20 through the Think 20 process. And is showing leadership on encouraging G20 countries to measure comprehensive wealth. BPS has done some very high quality work measuring natural capital already. Myself with my colleagues at IISD and also with colleagues at the University of Indonesia are building good research capacity in Indonesia to work on comprehensive wealth accounting. The proposed bill on appraisers and valuators is going to further advance the valuation of natural capital. So really, I think now the challenge is to ensure that there's good coordination between all of these efforts in Indonesia. There's a lot going on. All of it is great. And we simply need to make sure that the efforts are coordinated and that the results are used to drive new and sustainable policies. So I'll close with that and thank you very much.
Terima kasih banyak kepada Bapak Rob Smith atas presentasinya, dan karena keterbatasan waktu, maka setelah ini kita akan berlanjut ke diskusi panel dan semua pertanyaan akan bisa ditanyakan setelah sesi diskusi panel. Jadi untuk sesi diskusi panel, saya bermaksud untuk menyambut Bapak Hari Sutarmin dari DJKN. Kepada Bapak Hari Sutarmin, waktu dan tempat. Terima kasih.
Oke, terima kasih Mbak Naris. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi, salam sejahtera buat kita semua. Om Swastiastu. Mohon izin Bapak Ibu, saya Hari Sutarmin dari Direktorat Penilaian DJKN yang akan memandu untuk dialog dengan para narasumber kita. Yakni yang pertama telah hadir juga Pak Ari Haryono. Beliau adalah Direktur Penilaian. Kalau kita mengenal Pak Ari, sejak dulu beliau itu selalu berkecimpung dengan penilaian. Jadi memang beliau adalah sosok yang pas ya untuk mengomandoi Direktorat Penilaian karena background beliau, pengalaman beliau, dan juga jejaring beliau terkait dengan penilaian. Narasumber keduanya hadir juga di sini Pak Puji Agus Kurniawan. Beliau adalah Direktur Neraca Produksi dari BPS. Kami dari DJKN, dari Direktorat Penilaian, sering berkoordinasi, bersinergi dengan BPS. Tentunya pada saat kami menyusun Ocean Account ya, yang dibentuk oleh Menteri KKP, di mana Pak Ari selaku Pokja kedua untuk valuasi neraca monetisasi, sedangkan Pak Puji ada di Pokja ketiga. Terima kasih Pak Puji atas kehadirannya Pak Puji. Terus izin yang ketiga di sini juga telah hadir. Ini salah satu tokoh bagi saya ini role model ya Bapak Ibu semua. Saya memanggilnya Profesor Joko. Terima kasih Pak Joko Tri sudah berkenan untuk hadir di sesi ini. Kami yakin waktu Bapak yang sangat sibuk, tapi Bapak siap memberikan insight atau sharing terkait dengan apa-apa yang ada, dan mungkin pemikiran Bapak bisa menjadikan masukan bagi kami ya, terutama di penilaian. Mohon izin Bapak Ibu semua untuk Pak Ari dan Pak Puji, mengingat ini Pak Trijoko waktunya tinggal 15 menit Pak. Kami izin diskusi dulu dengan Pak Trijoko, Pak Ari.
Silakan Pak.
Oke, makasih. Assalamualaikum Pak Trijoko, mohon izin. Bapak
Waalaikumsalam,
Ibu,
Mas.
alhamdulillah Pak bertemu di forum ini Pak. Bapak Ibu mungkin kita pernah dengar Green Cukup 2018. Nah, beliau inilah selaku yang membidani lahirnya Green Cukup kita pertama kali di Indonesia, dan juga kalau tadi di paparan dijelaskan adanya salah satu yang mendorong SDGs adalah climate change. Nah, ini Pak Trijoko ini yang juga merubah paradigma dari mana climate change tentunya akan kita ke cost center, akan banyak lagi biaya-biaya yang dikeluarkan, tapi beliau bisa merubah paradigma pemikiran menjadi revenue center. Nah, mungkin kami bisa mendapatkan penjelasan dari Pak Joko gimana yang cost center ini bisa berubah menjadi revenue center. Mohon izin Prof, mungkin bisa disampaikan lebih dulu Prof.
Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi.
Waalaikumsalam.
Izin Pak Ari, Pak Puji, karena 9:30 kami harus memberikan paparan ke teman-teman Kanwil seprovinsi Jambi Pak, terkait dengan result based payment untuk pengelolaan biokarbon. Jadi untuk isu RED Plus, nah ini sekaligus nyambung yang tadi Mas Hari sampaikan ya, bahwa saat ini kan melalui Badan Pengelola Lingkungan Hidup, BPDLH, itu kita sudah bisa mengubah paradigma tadi Pak, khususnya ketika kita meminta daerah itu juga mulai melakukan upaya-upaya perbaikan, karena terkadang kan valuasi itu kalau belum ada duitnya itu ya susah ya meyakinkan orang ya Pak Ari ya.
Benar.
Dan ini yang saat ini sedang kami terus kembangkan. Saat ini kami sudah mengelola dana pembayaran berbasis kinerja baik dari pemerintah pusat maupun pemerintah daerah. Ada 103,8 juta US dollar itu pembayaran RBP untuk RED Plus nasional tahun 2014-2016. Kemudian yang di Jambi ini itu sebesar 50 juta US dollar Pak untuk 5 tahun. kemudian di Kalimantan Barat itu Kalimantan Timur itu 110 juta US dollar. Kemudian ada juga yang pembayaran Norway itu 56 juta US dollar. Dan ini tentu kita tetap menekankan kalau Ibu Menteri selalu memberikan pesan kan, tolong jaga tata kelolanya. Karena tata kelola itu menjadi kunci, kemudian kelembagaan, bisnis proses, SOP, safeguard itu selalu harus dikedepankan gitu ya, dan kami bekerja dalam koridor itu. Nah, menjadi menarik sebetulnya kemarin ngobrol dengan Mas Hari, nyun sewu Pak Arik belum sempat sowan ke Bapak. Jadi sebetulnya menjadi menarik ini, kalau proses natural capital itu nanti kemudian menjadi roh, karena kan sebetulnya gini, kita punya manajemen data, kemudian sudah ada regulasi terkait dengan rencana tata ruang daerah, rencana tata ruang wilayah. Tapi valuasi itu menjadi missing link-nya gitu. Karena ketika kita menetapkan rencana tata ruang, itu harus ada valuasinya. Supaya ketika terjadi peralihan penggunaan lahan, ya harus ada kompensasi yang sepadan gitu. Karena kalau di India, itu ada satu kantor khusus di bawah presiden yang tugasnya adalah memberikan valuasi semahal-mahalnya kepada seluruh kekayaan sumber daya alam supaya apa? Ya ini bentuk kita menjaga, bukan bentuk komersialisasi ya. Dan ini yang juga kami selalu tekankan ke teman-teman sektor Pak Arik, bahwa valuasi itu bukan kemudian artinya komersialisasi sumber daya alam, bukan. Itu cara terbaik kita untuk menjaga gitu. Kalau kita bilang kamu jangan tebang hutan ya, jangan merusak hutan. Kalau hanya dogmatis, diturunkan, kemudian ditekankan, ada punishment, tapi kita sendiri nggak ngerti kenapa sih harus jaga hutan gitu. Cara paling gampang kan dihitung aja, kamu jangan merusak hutan, karena ngembaliin fungsi hutan tuh biayanya segini loh, segitu mahalnya gitu. Nah itu kan cara paling gampang kita untuk menjaga sumber daya alam itu sendiri. Gitu. Nah ini yang juga terus coba kami koordinasikan dengan teman-teman sektor Pak Hari. Karena apa? Karena kalau kita lihat isu yang nanti akan segera kita masuki itu adalah isu terkait dengan perdagangan karbon. Nah itu menjadi menarik sebetulnya karena kalau kita bicara environmental integrity kemudian quality dari karbon, valuasi itu sangat relate gitu. Ya kan? Jadi kalau dalam mekanisme karbon itu kan sebenarnya kayak kita beli McD atau beli fast food gitu ya Pak ya. Ada paket hemat, ada paket komplit, ada paket sederhana gitu. Nah kalau karbonnya mau dihargai greenium, platinum, itu tentu paketnya harus paket yang valuable gitu. Di mana di situ ada aspek indigenous people, ada aspek biodiversity, dengan kelengkapan valuasinya. Supaya end-to-end-nya adalah kita punya quality karbon dengan harga platinum. Nah ini yang harusnya nanti kita, mungkin kami akan sowan ke Pak Ari untuk kita gimana nih mengartikulasikan relasi-relasi ke depannya gitu ya. Karena kami di forefront Pak Ari, kami di operator yang kemudian harus dilangsung dengan para investor, kemudian bagaimana mengelola dana-dana itu gitu. Kami butuh hitungan-hitungan dari valuasi ini, apalagi di dalam regulasi terkait dengan nilai ekonomi karbon, khususnya perdagangan karbon, kami juga diminta untuk berperan secara aktif. Karena kalau kita merujuk pada regulasi Perpres 98 terkait dengan nilai ekonomi karbon, ada 4 pelaku karbon ke depannya gitu. Dan ini tentu butuh valuasi yang bagus karena 4 pelaku karbon ini tentu akan menjual hasil pengelolaan sumber daya alamnya. Nah, tentu masing-masing harus bisa punya dasar valuasi sehingga mereka bisa bilang bahwa saya punya sertifikat yang benar-benar berkualitas gitu. Dengan harga karbon segini gitu ya. Itu tentu butuh valuasi yang bagus. Selain di pemerintah daerah itu sendiri sebagai pemilik kekayaan sumber daya alam itu gitu. Apalagi komitmen kita kan sudah luar biasa ya. Kalau dibandingkan negara lain bahkan Indonesia itu yang salah satu yang punya dokumentasi NDC itu yang begitu dinamis gitu. Tahun depan kita akan mengeluarkan second NDC. First NDC kita dari 2016 akan selesai tahun depan. Kemudian tahun depan kita mengeluarkan second NDC, dan enhanced NDC yang kita keluarkan tahun lalu itu bahkan setara dengan komitmen dari Amerika. Nah, ini yang tentu perlu kita jadikan pegangan, bahwa Indonesia itu nggak main-main ya. Tentu masih banyak keterbatasan, banyak problem, tapi kalau kita selalu berangkat dari masalah, ya nggak akan pernah ketemu solusinya gitu. Justru tantangan itu yang harus kita jadikan pijakan, bagaimana solusi yang nantinya akan bisa kita tawarkan. Karena kita juga jangan lupa bahwa kita negara berkembang gitu. Dan reading the wave-nya ini yang harus kita susun dengan baik ya. Kita jangan kemudian didikte oleh internasional juga, karena yang paham itu kan kita sebetulnya, yang tahu kebutuhan itu kita. Ambil contoh kasus misalnya PLTU batubara gitu ya. Negara maju mengatakan, ayo matiin batubara Anda. Ya, Anda bisa dengan gampang bicara matiin batubara karena Anda sudah selesai dengan pembangunan gitu. Sementara kita masih butuh ya pembangunan. Jadi kalau kita memang komit kemudian akan mematikan batubara, ya Anda harus memberikan kompensasi. Dan kami akan mengartikulasikan gimana mematikan batubara itu sesuai dengan kebutuhan developing country. Gitu. Nah, ini yang mudah-mudahan ke depan bisa kita sinergikan nih Pak Ari. Bagaimana valuasi itu kemudian memberikan output dan outcome di dalam seluruh kebijakan. Yang paling dekat dan paling menjadi challenging itu kalau menurut kami adalah isu perdagangan karbon ini gitu. Karena teman-teman OJK sudah siap melaju, kami sudah bikin kesepakatan dengan mereka, sudah dialog awal. Bulan depan itu kami akan memfasilitasi OJK dialog dengan seluruh pemangku kepentingan, karena bursa karbon Indonesia akan segera dirilis di bawah OJK, dan itu kan big bang ya, big bang yang kemudian harus kita skemakan dengan baik gitu. Jadi mulai bulan depan kami akan bekerja dengan OJK untuk melakukan banyak dialog-dialog dengan seluruh pemangku kepentingan supaya paradigmanya itu harus siap, kemudian kita jalankan, jangan jalan kemudian nanti lihat aja seperti apa gitu. Nah, ini yang mudah-mudahan nanti juga teman-teman dari DJKN bisa menjadi terlibat dengan kami ya secara aktif. Itu mungkin Mas Hari kurang lebih. Terima kasih.
Siap. Terima kasih Pak Joko atas insight dan informasinya. Mohon izin Pak Ari menginformasikan. Jadi Pak Tri Joko ini yang melakukan narasi terkait dengan laporan penilaian kita, Pak. Jadi beliau ini yang menyampaikan ke pemerintah daerah setempat, Pemprov maupun Pemda terkait dengan laporan penilaian piloting yang dulu kita lakukan. Jadi beliau bisa membaca sesuatu yang mungkin tidak kita baca gitu. Peluang ini tadi sudah disampaikan Pak Tri Joko. Terima kasih Profesor. Mungkin nanti kami akan silaturahmi Pak Ari ke Pak Tri Joko.
Pak Puji, terima kasih.
Terima kasih Pak Tri Joko atas waktunya. Monggo kalau ada kegiatan dan kesibukan.
Sukses Pak Joko,
sukses,
selamat
Pak.
beraktivitas.
Matur nuwun.
Terima kasih. Oke Bapak Ibu, semuanya kita berlanjut untuk panel diskusi ini. Dalam ini ada Pak Ari dan juga ada Pak Puji. Mungkin pertama kami izin ke Pak Ari dulu bagi Pak Ari. Kita tahu kalau akhir-akhir ini mungkin 1 tahun terakhir ini ya Pak Ari, Bapak dan tim bekerja keras terkait untuk melahirkan RUU penilai gitu Pak. Nah, kami ingin tahu Pak, apa sih nanti dampaknya undang-undang penilai terkait dengan implementasi neraca SDA yang ada di Indonesia Pak?
Baik, terima kasih Pak Ari. Selamat siang Bapak Ibu semua, Pak Puji khususnya, dan teman-teman dari World Bank juga. Terima kasih atas kesempatannya. Pertama, perlu kita ketahui ya, memang RUU penilai ini salah satu acuan kita dalam mengingatnya adalah salah satunya adalah pasal 33 ya, Undang-Undang Dasar 1945, di mana di dalamnya salah satu kaitannya karena bidang penilaian itu ada 3, yaitu terkait dengan properti, kemudian bisnis, dan sumber daya alam. Nah, walaupun tadi disampaikan belum sempat ketemu nih dengan Pak Joko Tri, namun apa yang disampaikan oleh Pak Joko Tri tadi ini satu fakta yang tidak bisa kita pungkiri, dan termasuk tadi saat kita menyimak apa yang disampaikan oleh Stefani maupun Rob menyampaikan ya bahwa SDA itu sangat penting. Bahkan tadi di bagian akhir penutupnya Rob menyampaikan diharapkan negara-negara lainnya pun akan melakukan hal yang sama, dan Stefani juga di bagian penutup menekankan ya memang itu tidak mudah karena saking kompleksitasnya. Saya melihat secara garis besar ini Mas Hari, dampak dari RUU penilai supaya nanti Bapak dan Ibu pahami ya, RUU penilai ini memang kita menjembatani sebuah wadah ya, undang-undang yang sejatinya sudah diperjuangkan kurang lebih 13 tahun yang lalu ya. Saat ini sedang proses harmonisasi, dan bagaimana tentunya sebuah undang-undang lahir karena ini nanti akan menjadi amanah dari Undang-Undang Dasar 45. Pertama saya melihat pasti akan memberikan landasan hukum yang kuat dan kepastian hukum. Ini Pak Puji ya. Oleh teman-teman yang sudah dilakukan selama ini oleh teman-teman BBS, kami tentunya kemarin juga di dalam harmonisasi menyampaikan bahwa apa yang sudah dilakukan oleh Kementerian Teknis sejatinya itu sudah sangat baik ya. Dan kami nanti akan supporting nanti terkait dari sisi bagaimana yang menjadi permasalahan selama ini. Kebetulan kami juga sempat berkeliling kemarin ke KLHK, ke KKP ya. Cuman khusus kepada BPS ini belum sempat karena jadwal Pak Puji masih sangat padat sekali ini, mohon izin. Dan kami juga ke Bappenas Pak, kemudian ke SDM. Nah, dengan banyaknya metode-metode yang ada, nah ini kita kemudian hadirnya David ya dari World Bank, yang kita memohon dan menyampaikan bahwa negara kita ini sangat serius. Ya tadi juga Rob menyinggung terkait dengan RUU penilai ini, supaya nanti metode yang bisa kita lakukan ini akan bisa menjadi satu keseragaman, kesamaan ya. Ini yang melaksanakan ya nanti di masing-masing tempat, namun kita akan melakukan standarisasi. Kebetulan penilai itu ada 2 sektor, yaitu yang di lingkungan pemerintah dan ada yang di sektor swasta atau yang kita kenal dengan penilai publik. Dari Ketua Umum MAPI pun ya, Pak Mutakin juga menyampaikan nantinya di dalam standar penilaian Indonesia ini akan diberikan ruang ya khusus untuk pengaturan-pengaturan di dalam metode-metode yang ada, evaluasi ekonomi yang selama ini juga sudah kita terapkan. Nah tentunya dengan adanya standar kompetensi yang lebih apa istilah kita ya lebih baik lah tentunya ya, dengan mengakomodir dari berbagai sumber yang ada, dengan menghadirkan para pakar-pakar yang ada. Nah ini tentunya akan menjadi hal yang selama ini kita tunggu. Jadi intinya di dalamnya juga akan menjadikan ini Mas Hadi, review sekaligus check and balance ya, di mana nanti akan ada majelis penilai Indonesia, dan jangan lupa satu lagi nih dampaknya nanti akan yang sangat besar itu yaitu terbentuknya pusat data transaksi nasional ya. Di dalamnya ada bisnis, ada properti sekaligus sumber daya alam, sehingga tentunya saya tidak perlu menjabarkan panjang lebar lagi nih Mas Ari, karena dari 2 pembicara sebelumnya sudah menjelaskan hal ini nanti ya. Artinya bagaimana manfaat dari neraca sumber daya alam itu sendiri. Kalau dari RUU-nya tadi yang saya sampaikan ada 3 hal setidaknya ya. Yang pasti adanya kepastian dan payung hukum, kemudian bagaimana nanti standar kompetensinya ya, sekaligus yang terakhir adalah terbentuknya nanti pusat data transaksi. Demikian saya rasa Mas Hadi. Terima kasih.
Oke, terima kasih Pak Direktur. Terus mungkin izin saya beralih ke Pak Puji, ya Pak Puji. Izin Pak Puji, berdasarkan PP Instrumen Ekonomi Lingkungan Hidup, PP 46 tahun 2017 mengamanatkan BPS untuk menyusun neraca ekonomi lingkungan, Pak. Nah, ada 4 neraca ruang lingkupnya, neraca aset, neraca aktivitas, neraca arus, dan neraca ekosistem. Nah, atau yang mungkin dari BPS menyebut dengan signaling, Pak, kita kenal dengan signaling, Pak. Nah, mungkin mohon Pak bisa dijelaskan ke kami, Pak, gimana sih penyusunan signaling ini dan tantangannya dalam penyusunan neraca tersebut, Pak.
Ya, baik. Terima kasih Pak Hari. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Selamat pagi seluruh peserta webinar di pagi ini. Pertama saya ucapkan terima kasih pada World Bank yang sudah menginisiasi pertemuan dan juga tadi 2 paparan yang sangat menarik bagi kami di BPS. Baik Pak Hari dan Bapak Ibu semua, jadi terkait dengan neraca kapital di Indonesia, kami di BPS itu mengacu pada pedoman seperti tadi yang disampaikan oleh Stefani, bahwa kita menggunakan System of National Accounts, kemudian juga kami menggunakan SEA, System of Environmental Economic Accounting, baik yang Central Framework maupun yang Ecosystem Accounting. Nah, berdasarkan beberapa pedoman tersebut, kami mencoba memformulasikan. Dan hambatan yang pertama kami temui adalah masalah ketersediaan data. Jadi kalau Bapak Ibu melihat salah satu output kami, yaitu signaling, Sistem Neraca Terintegrasi Ekonomi dan Lingkungan, ini meskipun tadi diapresiasi oleh Pak Robert bahwa datanya cukup bagus, dan ini saya akui ini bukan kerjasama, bukan hanya kerja BPS, ini adalah kerja bersama antara BPS dan juga kementerian lain termasuk Kementerian Keuangan, ada Kementerian Lingkungan Hidup, SDM dan sebagainya. Dan terakhir bahkan dengan Kementerian Kelautan dan Perikanan kami juga berkoordinasi. Jadi terkait dengan implementasi SEA tersebut, kami baru mampu menampilkan beberapa jenis aset. Dan dari beberapa jenis aset tersebut, kami pun baru menampilkan physical aset dan juga monetary. Tetapi untuk salah satu jenis aset, kami baru mampu menampilkan secara physical. Nah, ini keterbatasan kami, oleh karena itu dengan adanya webinar ini kami membuka peluang untuk memperluas kerjasama. Nah, cakupan dari SE ini cukup besar sehingga kami mencoba membuka peluang area-area mana yang bisa kami lakukan. Artinya dalam jangka pendek ini kami lakukan. Termasuk beberapa tahun terakhir ini kami berkolaborasi dengan Kementerian Kelautan dan Perikanan dalam mengembangkan Ocean Accounts. Nah, ini yang sudah kami lakukan. Dan tadi juga terima kasih Pak Firdaus sudah memberikan beberapa insight di kolom chat. Jadi ini yang kami lakukan. Dan kami memang memiliki keterbatasan resources, bukan hanya data, tetapi juga SDM, kemudian juga masalah pendanaan. Sehingga ketika kami ingin memperkaya dari signaling itu, kami hanya berdasarkan pada in-depth studi yang kami lakukan. Itu pun tidak bisa sepanjang tahun kami lakukan. Jadi beberapa agenda, misalkan 2 tahun yang lalu kami fokus ke Ocean Account, dan tahun ini kami mencoba fokus kepada biodiversity dan juga climate change. Dan di tahun 2024 nanti kami akan fokus kepada ekonomi hijau atau green economy. Nah, ini Pak Hari dan Bapak Ibu yang kami lakukan. Jadi ini masih masih banyak keterbatasan, dan kami sangat membuka peluang untuk mendapatkan masukan dalam rangka peningkatan apa yang kami hasilkan. Dan kemudian terakhir yang tadi Pak Hari singgung masalah peraturan pemerintah. Jadi di sana memang diamanatkan bahwa BPS sebagai koordinator untuk data-data lingkungan hidup. Dan akhirnya di tahun ini kami juga sudah mengeluarkan peraturan badan atau perban mengenai neraca ekonomi lingkungan. Nah, di sini juga kami berkoordinasi dengan beberapa kementerian dan kami juga menyampaikan ada sejenis kursus online untuk ke seluruh stakeholder yang terkait. Nah, kursus online ini sangat kami butuhkan karena ada perbedaan persepsi, ada perbedaan metodologi yang digunakan oleh beberapa kementerian. Sementara internasional itu merekomendasikan menggunakan SEA. Nah, inilah jembatan agar pihak-pihak stakeholder atau kementerian terkait dapat mengikuti sejauh mungkin dapat mengikuti rekomendasi-rekomendasi yang ada di dalam SEA. Nah, ini sudah kita lakukan dan ya kita bergerak terus ya, mudah-mudahan ke depan semakin lama akan semakin baik sehingga apa yang bisa kita hasilkan ini bisa dimanfaatkan oleh seluruh stakeholder termasuk juga internasional. Seperti tadi yang disampaikan oleh Pak Robert bahwa IISD juga akan menghasilkan data termasuk Indonesia. Yang mudah-mudahan nanti kebutuhan-kebutuhan data tersebut bisa dipenuhi dari Link tersebut. Terima kasih Pak Ari.
Siap, terima kasih Pak Puji atas penjelasannya yang komprehensif. Jadi mohon izin Bapak Ibu semua, di sini juga hadir Pak Firda. Beliau Direktur Konservasi Hayati dari KKP. Jadi kami setahun terakhir ini dengan di-lead oleh KKP melakukan penyusunan ocean account gitu ya terhadap beberapa kawasan konservasi nasional. Nah, ini juga kan harus menjadi perhatian juga untuk teman-teman daerah karena wilayah konservasi tidak hanya di nasional, di daerah juga ada yang juga harus mendapatkan perhatian gitu. Dan kita semuanya yakin ya dan percaya kalau Indonesia ini kan negara yang adikuasa, kalau adidaya terkait dengan sumber daya alamnya, dan tidak mungkin kegiatan yang besar ini kita lakukan oleh satu kementerian sendiri. Tidak mungkin Kementerian Keuangan atau DJK bisa melakukannya. Pasti membutuhkan sinergi, membutuhkan kerjasama dengan kementerian terkait. Nah, harapannya ini apa yang sudah di-lead atau kita lakukan di KKP ini bisa kita terapkan ya Pak ke beberapa untuk sektor yang lain. Izin tadi Pak Puji sudah menyampaikan beberapa hambatan terkait dalam penyusunan neraca. Nah, saya ingin ada penjelasan dari Pak Ari ya Pak. Pak Ari, apa sih permasalahannya teman-teman di lapangan Pak terkait dengan penilaian sumber daya alam ini Pak? Kalau tadi Pak Puji sudah menyampaikan hambatannya, keterbatasan data. Nah, kalau dari sisi penilaian seperti apa Pak? Untuk penilaian sumber daya alam ini sulit atau hambatan bagi para penilai kita? Terima kasih.
Baik, terima kasih Mas Hari. Ini kita jawab terkait dengan hambatan sama persis tadi yang disampaikan oleh Pak Uji ya. Pertama, kalau kita bicara data ini, kami juga sudah sampaikan kepada teman-teman Bank Dunia, khususnya Green David ya, terkait dengan masalah data, karena itu kita dalam konteks saat ini ya, beberapa 1-2 tahun terakhir, kita sering ngumpul bareng ini, adanya kebijakan satu peta, kemudian dengan teman-teman di Green juga, kemudian maupun kementerian lembaga yang lain. Bagaimana mengatasi masalah kekurangan data, khususnya terkait dengan sumber daya alam. Di dalam pembahasan kemarin harmonisasi pun pada saat kita pusat data transaksi yang terkait SDA, apa sih harapan yang ada di sana yang dilakukan. Nah, selama ini memang karena belum ada payung hukum yang untuk yang terkait dengan kepentingan valuasi dalam konteks yang luas ya, termasuk untuk kebijakan fiskal nantinya. Nah, ini kita akan bersinergi, melakukan kolaborasi antar kementerian lembaga. Nah, Ini pun juga masalah kolaborasi pernah disinggung juga ini Mas Hari, Pak Puji, Bapak Ibu semua pada saat pemaparan Mbak Sari ya dalam menyampaikan studi kasus terkait dengan kertas kerjanya sustainability development ya untuk ocean account juga. Nah, hambatan tadi data dan kolaborasi yang diperlukan tadi ini akan kita coba betul untuk diatasi dengan konsepsi di dalam RUU penilai salah satunya itu, dan juga masalah keterbatasan knowledge ya disinggung oleh Pak Puji. Sejatinya memang kalau kita cek kemarin ini Pak Puji, memang pada saat bicara apakah kelautan, kemudian nanti kehutanan maupun mineral energi dan lain sebagainya, khususnya nih nanti yang tangible mungkin sudah lebih banyak dibahas ya. Tapi pada saat bicara intangible asetnya, ini banyak metode-metode yang kemudian di sini masih boleh dikatakan belum ketemu di titik mana yang akan kita gunakan. Atau salah satu contoh, misalkan salah satu contoh nih ya, ada sebuah kajian yang menyampaikan bahwa nilai karbon dari laut maupun hutan itu yang ada di Indonesia kurang lebih itu disebutkan 8.000 triliun misalkan, seperti itu. Nah ini kan kita juga belum tahu persis ini sejauh mana 8.000 triliun itu. Kalau kita bicara LKPP, nilai aset tetap maupun investasi ya saat ini kurang lebih 11.000 triliun lebih. Nah itu semua kan bisa kita cek ya. Nah kemarin juga dengan teman-teman di BPK khususnya pada saat bicara transparansi kebijakan fiskal dan lain sebagainya. Hal yang demikian ini Mas Ari mungkin akan hambatan-hambatan yang ada ini terkait keterbatasan dari sisi knowledge yang ada. Ini kita akan ketemukan semua nanti. Kita bisa duduk bareng semua. Kalau mandatory tentunya dikatakan tadi kewenangan-kewenangan yang ada selama ini bagaimana? Ya kita luar biasa harus mengajukan menyampaikan apresiasi ini khususnya kepada teman-teman di BPS, kemudian di KKP, di KLHK khususnya yang kita belakangan ini banyak terlibat dengan piloting project ya yang melibatkan berbagai ragam juga pakar di dalamnya. Ini yang kemarin juga kami sampaikan ini kepada David, bahwa keseriusan kita dalam hal ini memang benar-benar untuk sesuatu yang besar. Dibilang tadi disinggung-singgung Indonesia kaya ya, kaya sekali misalkan. Tapi berapa kekayaan yang sebenarnya itu? Apalagi nanti kalau bicara, karena bicara valuasi itu tidak hanya sebatas tadi sudah disinggung di awal ya. Tadi Mas Joko juga menyampaikan, tidak hanya masalah eksploitasinya saja, ya. Bagaimana kita menghitung apa yang kemudian bisa kita gunakan, tapi bagaimana untuk reservasinya, bagaimana untuk menjaganya, bagaimana kalau terjadi sesuatu dengan adanya isu besar dunia ya, climate change itu mau tidak mau itu. Bagaimana fungsi hutan menjadi sedemikian rupa, fungsi terumbu karang menjadi begitu penting dan lain sebagainya. Nah, hambatan-hambatan ini yang tadi sempat kita singgung secara garis besar, Mas Hari, tentunya punya keyakinan yang sama lah ya kita BPS juga karena dibilang tadi ya kita tidak bicara nanti hanya sebatas angka-angka saja, namun apa yang kemudian disinggung oleh Robert Smith tadi terkait wealth nation, yaitu bahwa kita juga harus benar-benar bisa mengukurnya sedemikian rupa. Saya rasa itu, Mas Ari. Jadi beberapa hambatan yang saat ini terjadi, yang termasuk regulasinya juga. Terima kasih.
Oke, terima kasih Pak Ari. Izin tadi saya mereview yang disampaikan Pak Puji sebelumnya ya. Jadi dari BPS dalam menyusun signaling berpedoman pada SEEE Pak. Jadi Sistem Economic Environmental Accounting. Nah, terima kasih sekali Pak Puji, kami dari Direktorat Penilaian berkesempatan untuk tahun kemarin ikut di program pelatihan yang ada di BPS Pak Puji. Nah, harapannya sih tahun ini kita dapat lagi Pak Beli, dapat kuota, dan jika memang memungkinkan mungkin teman-teman yang ada di vertikal bisa berkesempatan untuk ikut juga Pak Gina. Karena dari pelajaran itu kami baru tahu Pak, ternyata apa yang ada di pedoman kami kurang tepat, dan ini perlu kami lakukan penyesuaian gitu Pak Budi. Jadi harapan kami sih kami bisa lagi diikutkan untuk sekolah evaluasi atau yang di-lead oleh BPS itu Pak. Terus izin Pak Puji tadi disampaikan terkait karena untuk penyusunan signaling membutuhkan kolaborasi sinergi dengan beberapa pihak, kementerian atau lembaga. Nah, apakah masih ada ruang untuk dilakukan peningkatan koordinasi atau sinergi Pak Puji dalam penyusunan signaling ini, sehingga penyusunan implementasi neraca sumber daya alam bisa lebih baik lagi? Apakah masih bisa dimungkinkan untuk ditingkatkan sinergi dan koordinasinya?
Sangat Pak, sangat. Jadi karena kalau kita melihat cakupan dari SIE ini kan memang cukup luas, dan seperti yang saya sampaikan tadi bahwa sebentar saya tampilkan aja ya, saya tampilkan cakupan daripada ya, terlihat?
Iya, terlihat.
Ya. Jadi kalau kita melihat dari cakupan SIE di sini merekomendasikan untuk menyusun ada sekitar 8 jenis aset. Dari 8 jenis aset ini BPS baru mampu menyajikan untuk energy and mineral resources, kemudian timber resources ini alhamdulillah dua-duanya kita bisa sajikan baik secara physical account maupun monetary account. Tetapi untuk land account kita baru menyampaikan secara physical. Nah, area-area yang masih kami beri tanda silang ini adalah area kita untuk membuka kerjasama dengan kementerian-kementerian yang terkait. Karena BPS tidak memiliki resources terkait dengan data-data tersebut. Nah, memang meskipun BPS sudah terlibat dalam implementasi SIE sejak tahun 90-an, kami mulai secara reguler merilis signaling itu di tahun 2014. Nah, sejak kami rilis tahun 2014 itu belum banyak penggunanya. Pengguna signaling ini belum banyak. Ini terbukti dari belum adanya pertanyaan-pertanyaan terkait dengan signaling. Sebenarnya kami berharap ada masukan, ada informasi terkait dengan data-data yang kami butuhkan. Karena jujur Bapak Ibu semua, kami ini tidak mengetahui secara persis, katakan misalkan untuk soil resources, ini datanya ada di kementerian mana gitu. Nah, ini yang kami tidak tahu. Jadi bersyukur saya pagi ini bisa turut serta di dalam webinar yang diikuti peserta cukup banyak ya, sampai 300-an. Saya berharap ada informasi, ada masukan, ini data-data ini ada di mana gitu. Sehingga kami bisa memperluas kerjasama antar kementerian.
Ya, betul.
Nah, kami juga alhamdulillah ketemu Pak Ari di timnya neraca sumber daya laut ya.
Iya.
Artinya kami juga bisa memperkaya untuk monetary accounts.
Ya.
Memang kalau melihat cakupannya cukup banyak, tetapi kita bisa memulai dengan data yang tersedia. Data
betul.
apa dulu yang tersedia itu yang kita bangun.
Kerjakan dulu ya.
Iya, jadi kita tidak ambisius untuk mengcover seluruhnya. Ya, tetapi kita secara bertahap menambah konten daripada neraca ekonomi lingkungan ini, tetapi progres gitu, ada progres ya setiap waktu. Nah, ini yang sebenarnya masih kami butuhkan. Jadi selama ini kami tuh mendapatkan data dari Badan Geologi, kemudian ada Kementerian Lingkungan Hidup, Badan Informasi Geospasial, dan juga Kementerian Keuangan. Ini datanya kita dapatkan. Dan mungkin juga nanti dengan KKP, dengan neraca sumber daya lautnya, ini juga bisa memperkaya signaling kita. Mungkin itu Pak Ari. Jadi sekali lagi sangat terbuka peluang untuk berkolaborasi. Sekali lagi ini bukan untuk BPS, ini untuk Indonesia.
Indonesia.
Ya, apalagi tadi Pak Robert Smith mengatakan bahwa di dalam forum G20 Indonesia sangat mendorong untuk menyusun statistik beyond GDP. Jadi di internasional juga sudah disepakati ya, ada data gaps inisiatif fase 3. Itu berbicara perubahan iklim, kemudian well-being, dan juga berbagi pakai data. Nah, ini semua di dalam 14 rekomendasi itu BPS terlibat di sekitar 6 rekomendasi. Artinya apa? Artinya kita sangat mensupport pemerintah Indonesia. Tinggal permasalahannya adalah bagaimana kita mengumpulkan data dan juga menilai data dari aset tersebut. Nah, kemudian terkait kursus online, ya insya Allah nanti coba akan kami koordinasikan, kita akan buka lagi, dan nanti akan kami share kepada seluruh stakeholder. Makasih Pak Ari.
Terima kasih Pak Puji atas tanggapan dan penjelasannya. Terus tadi disampaikan Pak Puji kan memang kita ada masih ada sekat-sekat gitu Bang. Nah, izin Pak Hari, apakah nanti di Undang-Undang Penilai di RU ini di kekurangan atau kelemahan ini bisa dicarikan solusi di RUU tersebut, Pak, sehingga ada sinergi yang lebih baik lagi dalam rangka penyusunan neraca sumber daya alam.
Baik, terima kasih. Salah satu yang melandasi urgensi dari RUU penilai itu terkait dengan SDA, terkait dengan kondisi ya. Beberapa kali contohnya yang kita lakukan pada saat itu sama yang disampaikan oleh Pak Puji. Jadi isu-isu besar terkait kerahasiaan dan lain sebagainya, tidak bisa diberikan data dan lain sebagainya, itu sehingga menjadi sesuatu yang sulit untuk kita bergerak di saat tidak ada payung hukum yang mengamanahkan untuk bisa terjadinya sebuah data yang ideal yang diharapkan. Tentunya dalam pemahaman untuk yang sifatnya rahasia tidak ke publik, ya tentunya tidak disampaikan ke publik. Namun dalam hal konteks tertentu, termasuk kemarin di dalam harmonisasi ini Pak Ari, teman-teman saat ada diskusi dari KKP kan juga dari teman-teman DJP juga ya, ini menyampaikan hal yang sama. Jadi terkait transaksi-transaksi di sektor mineral energi misalkan ya dan lain sebagainya. Nah, dengan adanya undang-undang nanti ya dengan diatur sedemikian rupa di dalam ketentuan peraturan perundang-undangannya, dalam PP dan lain sebagainya, ya hal-hal yang seperti itu akan ada solusinya. Nah, kalau kita ingat apa yang disampaikan oleh Profesor Stein ya, dari Adler University Norwegia, itu masih ingat kita pada saat bicara sumber daya alam. Pertama itu ini nyambung yang disampaikan oleh Pak Puji tadi. Kita mapping dulu, dan itu yang sudah dilakukan oleh teman-teman di BPS. Secara mapping, secara keseluruhan SDA kita ini apa saja, ini yang sudah dilakukan oleh teman. Jadi kita tidak memulai dari nol ya. Kita sebenarnya sudah punya start yang bagus, tapi memang segala keterbatasan yang ada, sama pada saat DJKN pada saat itu, Kementerian Keuangan rapat dengan pendapat dengan Komisi 11 pada saat menyampaikan apa yang sudah dilakukan oleh teman-teman di lingkungan DJKN terkait dengan piloting project penilaian SDA. Nah, itu kan disampaikan. Begitu banyaknya nanti, dan harus ada skala-skala prioritas nih Pak Puji ya. Nah, Pak Puji tadi sudah memberikan gambaran ya apa yang kita punya dulu. Nggak bisa juga kita terlalu ngoyo semuanya harus langsung semua sekarang, tidak. Tapi kami punya keyakinan ya, karena nanti dengan adanya mapping, kemudian tahap keduanya ada yang kita sebut dengan valuatingnya atau valuationnya, baru kemudian terakhirnya dari sisi accountingnya secara keseluruhan. Nah, ketiga tahapan ini menjadi hal yang akan dilakukan secara bersama-sama di saat memang regulasi sudah memungkinkan itu. Ini yang juga David berkali-kali meyakinkan kepada kita ya, bagaimana nanti akan penerapannya di Indonesia. Ya, kita harus berani optimis menyampaikan karena melihat urgensinya ini, terutama untuk stabilitas perekonomian nasional ya. Bicara SDA ini sudah sangat luar biasa. Jadi masih ingat yang disampaikan oleh Robert ya, di mana untuk masalah natural resources ini yang paling banyak sekarang ini apa istilah kita ini ruang perbaikannya ya, dibandingkan tadi dengan misalkan bisnis ataupun publik ya. Nah, berangkat dari situ, Mas, hari ini saya menekankan sekali lagi memang ya bahwasanya kendala yang selama bertahun-tahun ini ada, ini dengan adanya nanti sinergisitas yang akan tercipta ini, terbentuknya ruang-ruang yang memungkinkan untuk itu, apalagi kalau bicara kebijakan fiskal ya. Masih ingat waktu yang disampaikan di Queensland University ya, bahwa di atau Kementerian Keuangan Australia pada saat kita bertemu dengan mereka di Australia pun itu seluruh kementerian lembaga terkait ya, itu memang menyampaikan data-datanya karena memang sudah ada aturan yang mengatur itu untuk kebijakan fiskal, yang terutama kebijakan fiskal, monetisasi kebijakan fiskal, karena ada bicara masalah potensi, masalah nanti di situ ada cadangan dan lain sebagainya yang begitu cukup banyak ada di dalam ya. Nah, saya ini sudah satu nafas dengan yang disampaikan oleh Pak Puji tadi. Jadi apa-apa yang data-data yang dimiliki oleh teman-teman di BPS, apa yang sudah dilakukan oleh teman-teman di BPS, nanti pada saat bicara secara lebih besar dan lebih besar lagi, semuanya yang termasuk misalkan neraca ekonomi lingkungan tadi yang disebutkan, kita mengenal ada 4 neraca, misalkan ya, ada yang disebut dengan neraca aset, kemudian neraca arus, ada neraca aktivitas, neraca ekosistemnya itu sendiri, maka ini akan menjadi sangat luar biasa. Saya atau kami semua dengan sinergi yang baik sangat yakin ini akan bisa terwujud pada saatnya yang tidak terlalu lama ya Pak Puji ya. Kalau saatnya nanti, tapi nanti terlalu lama ya sayang juga. Saya rasa ini pasti akan apa yang disampaikan oleh khususnya di kementerian lembaga ini kepada jajaran-jajaran nanti khususnya anggota dewan dan lain sebagainya pasti akan dapat memahami hal seperti ini. Demikian Pak Ari.
Oke, terima kasih Pak Direktur, Pak Ari. Untuk Bapak Ibu partisipan, monggo disiapkan pertanyaan, nanti bisa langsung menanyakan ke speaker narasumber kita. Sebelum pertanyaan ke peserta, saya izin ke Pak Ari lagi, Pak Ari. Kami ingin tahu Pak, mungkin apa sih yang akan atau yang sudah dilakukan atau yang diharapkan dari Direktorat Penilaian dalam rangka untuk peningkatan kompetensi penilaian SDH penilainya Pak, baik di vertikal maupun di pusat Pak. Mungkin ada penjelasan gambaran dari Bapak.
Ya. Sama persis yang disampaikan beberapa waktu yang lalu saat kami diskusi dengan teman-teman dari World Bank ya, juga ada Mbak Naris di sana, kemudian teman-teman dari UI, dari beberapa unsur yang ada di dalamnya. Memang kalau bicara SDA, selain masalah regulasi, masalah kolaborasi dan lain sebagainya, itu jangan lupa juga terkait dengan ini harapan kita ya, untuk kompetensi dari SDM yang ada baik di lingkungan DJKN maupun nanti yang ada di kementerian lembaga. Sehingga kita berharap selalu ada kerjasama yang baik lah dalam hal ini. Sehingga setiap hal-hal yang ini bisa kita koordinasikan secara bersama-sama tentunya. Ya, kalau kita lihat, kita juga sudah banyak melakukan diklat-diklat yang sudah dilakukan nih Mas Hari, baik dengan institusi khususnya di dalam negeri ya, seperti dengan UGM, kemudian dengan IPB, ataupun dari teman-teman kementerian lembaga yang tadi disampaikan oleh Pak Puji tadi seperti online dan lain sebagainya. Namun demikian memang supaya ini nanti benar-benar yang akan kita kerjakan ini dan yang sudah kita kerjakan bahkan ya, piloting kan sudah beberapa yang sudah jalan seperti yang tadi disampaikan, seperti kayak penilaian kawasan konservasi kelautan perikanan, kemudian piloting SDA panas bumi, hutan konservasi, hutan produksi, dan banyak hal yang lagi yang lainnya itu juga diharapkan akan bisa kita melalui World Bank, ini salah satunya ya, melalui World Bank yang memang memungkinkan karena World Bank ini mempunyai networking yang sangat besar ya Pak Puji ya. Jadi yang terhadap negara-negara tadi yang disebutkan termasuk ada New Zealand, ada Swedia, ya, ada Belanda dan lain sebagainya itu ya, kita bisa ikut sertakan ya dalam konteks untuk peningkatan SDM yang ada. Demikian Mas Heri.
Oke, terima kasih. Monggo Bapak Ibu, barangkali kita diskusi ya. Jadi bisa juga ke tadi pemateri pertama ke Mr. Robert ya. Jadi bisa ke pemateri yang dari luar ataupun dari Pak Ari dan Pak Puji.
Ya,
monggo mungkin
untuk Mbak Naris, untuk Mr. Robert Smith maupun Stefani untuk bisa dihadirkan di ruang ini ya supaya nanti bisa sekaligus. Jadi kita bisa diskusi secara bersama-sama.
Ya, terima kasih Pak. Monggo Bapak Ibu, ada yang present mau menyampaikan langsung ke
itu Mas Jerry, Mas Jerry.
Oh iya. Siap. Mas Jerry, silakan Mas Jerry. Monggo Mas Jerry.
Hello. Sounds clear there?
Ada.
Clear Mas Jerry.
Okay, I want to send my question to Stephanie and Rob. First, small question to Stephanie. Appreciate from your research in Indonesia during your last time here. And then my question is just like, in your opinion, Steph, how to measure the natural capital asset, especially in the forest sector, specifically in method that represent Indonesia tropical forest. And then you deliver some kind of method, but in your opinion, which one is particularly represent the Indonesian tropical forest, since Indonesian tropical forest is at least 10% of the world, and then for Rob, my question is just like, since the GDP formula, it's like consumption, government spending, and export means import, and then we added some comprehensive wealth. In your opinion, the comprehensive wealth such represent that produce natural human capital, and we put that as the multiple of GDP, or we add just kind of like a comprehensive wealth plus GDP, or it represent an index of the GDP. And then the important thing is like for natural and the human capital, there is kind of what could we say, just like we need to monetize that, since the GDP represents by number of money, and then it put it at the fiscal sector. And maybe I need more broadened perspective about this. Thank you very much.
Ya, terima kasih Mas Jerry. Mungkin dari partisipan yang lain mau bertanya dulu ke
Mungkin sebaiknya langsung, Mas.
Langsung aja.
Sebaiknya langsung biar enggak ini.
Ya mungkin bisa direspon langsung ya Mbak Naris sama Stephanie sama Rob terkait pertanyaan dari Mas Jerry.
Ya, baik Pak. Jadi izin menginfokan bahwa untuk Bu Stephanie saat ini sudah tidak ada di sini, tapi pertanyaannya bisa diwakili oleh Pak Robert yang saat ini masih ada di sini. So Robert, we have 2 questions so far from Pak Jerry. The first is about how to measure forest asset, especially in tropical forest. Which method is suitable for Indonesia? And the second is how do we implement comprehensive wealth? Do we combine it with GDP? And what do we need to do to monetize it and channel it to fiscal policy? So to Rob, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Naris. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of measuring tropical forests or any kind of forest, first and foremost, the measurement needs to take place in physical terms before any evaluation can be carried out. And the point that I think is the most important to keep in mind when forests or any biological asset is being measured is to capture as much of the qualitative dimensions of the forest as possible. So, for example, the simplest measure of a forest is simply the area covered by the forest, so the number of hectares covered by the forest. But knowing how many hectares of tropical forest Indonesia has is not particularly interesting from a natural capital point of view, because not every hectare of forest is the same. There are different trees of different species, of different ages, found in different parts of Indonesia. So that diversity, that richness of the forest ecosystem needs to be captured to the extent possible in the physical data on forests. And of course, some of that detail can be captured using GIS, satellite imagery, but not all of it can. So ideally, there would be an effort to measure forest assets that would rely in part on GIS data, but also on data collected through physical surveys of the forest. So Statistics Canada is beginning something that it calls the census of the environment, where they're going to be collecting detailed physical data on all Canadian ecosystems. And there may be some interesting information that you can gather or advice that you can get from Statistics Canada on their approaches to measuring forest assets. So in terms of the second question, how do we implement comprehensive wealth? Do we combine it with GDP? Well, we don't combine it with GDP exactly, but what I said during the presentation is that we need to present comprehensive wealth along with GDP. So it needs to be a measure that sits beside GDP and presents a different perspective on development. So you will recall that I made the point that wealth is the basis for income. And wealth is therefore what matters in the long run. So we need to present these two statistics together, comprehensive wealth on the one hand, and then GDP on the other hand, and we need to track their evolution simultaneously so that we understand when we observe growing GDP, we understand whether that growing GDP is based on an asset base that is also growing, or whether it is in fact based on the depletion of certain categories of assets. So it's really a question of measuring both and understanding how to use both in informing policy and decision making. I see some other questions in the chat box, Naris. Would you like me to respond to those, or do we want to take some more questions from the audience?
Yeah, Robert, you can answer the question from that.
Sure. Okay. So the first question that I see, so there was a question about how comprehensive wealth can inform decisions related to fiscal planning, investment, and long-term sustainability in Canada. Well, I think the answer to that question is that there are many ways in which comprehensive wealth measures could inform decision-making in Canada. Unfortunately, the reality is that at the moment, the government of Canada does not use comprehensive wealth measures to inform decision-making. I believe it should use them, and my colleagues at IISD also believe that it should use them. But the fact is that it does not. If it did, if comprehensive wealth was used in Canada alongside GDP to drive government decision making, one of the things that I think probably would be different in Canada would be the decisions that we make about the use of the income that we derive from the extraction of our fossil fuels. So we derive a lot of income from exploiting our fossil fuels, but we don't reinvest very much of that income in other assets that could be used to replace the fossil fuels when they disappear. And in part, we don't do that because we don't understand that when we extract fossil fuel assets, we're really depleting a capital asset, and that therefore some of the income should be considered depletion rather than true income. So there's a variety of ways in which I think decision-making would be better in Canada if we used comprehensive wealth. But the fact is that the government has not made that decision to do so. There's an interesting question about whether natural resource wealth is a blessing or a curse. And I think it's both, depending upon how the income is used. So again, to the point that I just made about Canada, in some ways, the income derived from natural resource exploitation in Canada is a curse, because it makes some parts of the country feel like they are richer than they are, that they have more income than they really do have. And so therefore they spend more money than arguably they should spend. So it's a curse in that way. On the other hand, if you look at a country like Norway, where they have been able to invest an awful lot of the income from the exploitation of their oil and gas assets and create a very large government wealth portfolio, financial wealth portfolio, then I would argue that natural resource wealth is in fact a blessing and not a curse. So I think that Indonesia has some important decisions to make on this question of how does it want to use the income that it derives from its very abundant natural resources. It can be a blessing or it can be a curse. And if it's done incorrectly, it may, in the end, be a curse. But I see lots of encouraging signs that you are moving in the right direction with your decision making. So let's hope that it ends up being a blessing and not a curse. Yeah, so there's a point about the use of a volume index to measure natural capital, and a question about whether we can learn more about that. I would love to spend some time talking about how a volume index could be used in Indonesia to portray the evolution of natural capital in a different way. So if that's something that's of interest to you, I'd be happy to follow up on that with you. I mean, I have to say that I'm very impressed with the integrated environmental accounts that BPS has produced. You've done a very good job, and you have no reason to be anything but proud of that effort. So congratulations to everyone who took part in that. And I think it positions you extremely well to consider some more sophisticated work, like the development of a volume index, for example. But there aren't very many countries that are further ahead than Indonesia at this point in time. So congratulations on that. I think that covers all the questions in the chat box, but Neris or David, if I've missed anything, please feel free to, or Harry, please feel free to.
Okay. Thank you, Rob. Terima kasih, Rob. Kita juga we are so proud with achievement of BPS to make a seasonally. Bapak Ibu, kita masih ada waktu 6 menit ya. Barangkali monggo kita maksimalkan.
Saya mau jawab, ada pertanyaan dari
Oh,
Pak
siap.
Sumarsono.
Ada pertanyaan ini dari chat
Pak
ke Pak Arik ya, dari Pak Sumarsono. Oke, izin, apakah RUU penilai sudah dibandingkan dengan undang-undang yang sama milik negara-negara lain, sehingga norma dan standarnya juga berlaku secara internasional? Monggo, Pak Arik.
Baik, terima kasih Pak Sumarsono atas pertanyaannya. Memang benar, dalam setiap penyusunan sebuah rancangan undang-undang, khususnya mengikut kepada Undang-Undang Nomor 13 Tahun 2022 yang merupakan perubahan atas Undang-Undang Nomor 12 Tahun 2011. Untuk menyusun sebuah undang-undang, syarat yang saat ini harus dilakukan itu membuat semacam cost benefit analisisnya, ya, karena dianggap biaya undang-undang itu sangat tinggi, maka sekarang harus bisa dimonetisasi terlebih dahulu. Apakah nanti dampak dari undang-undang itu memang akan menjadi lebih besar untuk negara. Nah, kenapa sebuah undang-undang terkait profesi harus dibuat di Indonesia? Itu bagaimana praktek-prakteknya di negara-negara lain, itu menjadi syarat pertama terlebih dahulu. Selain itu, tentunya kita di dalam penyusunan naskah akademis, jadi sebelum sampai pada proses harmonisasi di dalam penyusunan naskah akademis bersama Bapak dan Ibu dari BPHN, ya, Badan Perancangan Hukum Nasional, di sana itu setiap negara, bahkan kalau karena RUU penilai itu di negara-negara seperti Eropa, Amerika, kemudian di Asia, di Australia, kita juga sampaikan contoh-contohnya. Nah, selain yang ada di negara-negara luar, termasuk profesi-profesi yang ada di Indonesia saat ini. Bahkan di kita sektor keuangan, salah satu profesi yang belum punya undang-undang adalah penilai. Sementara untuk advokat, notaris, akuntan itu sudah ada. Termasuk profesi yang lain seperti keinsinyuran, kemudian kedokteran, dan saat ini juga terkait dengan kesehatan. Sehingga tentunya ya untuk sampai dengan proses penyusunan RUU tidak bisa mau-mau sendiri, ya. Ini harus betul-betul sudah merupakan praktek baik yang berlaku di dalam negeri maupun di luar negeri. Sebagai tambahan informasi saja, profesi penilai di Indonesia mulai dikenal dari tahun 1970-an. Itu artinya sudah 50 tahunan profesi ini ada di kita. Kemudian kita mengenal namanya masyarakat profesi penilai Indonesia, itu merupakan asosiasi penilai publik atau penilai swasta, itu juga sudah berulang tahun. Yang kemarin ini ke 41 tahun. Jadi demikian Mas Sumarsono, ya, jangan khawatir bahwa kita benar-benar membuat undang-undang ini sesuai dengan konsesi baik yang norma-normanya, standarnya yang berlaku di dalam negara kita maupun yang di luar. Terima kasih, demikian Mas.
Terima kasih Pak Ari. Bapak Ibu, karena waktu sudah di akhir pengunjung, jadi kami kembalikan lagi ke Mbak Naris. Untuk selanjutnya mungkin nanti ada closing dari Mr. David. Tapi karena tadi Mbak Naris berpantun, jadi izinkanlah saya juga berpantun. Jadi kuda betina berlari-lari, lalu melompat, nabrak lemari. Alam sekitar dijaga lestari, agar kehidupan indah berseri.
Cakep.
Terima kasih Pak Puji, Pak Ari, dan Mr. Robert atas presentasi dan wawasan dan juga informasi knowledge yang di-sharing diberikan kepada kami. Semoga kita bisa mewujudkan apa yang menjadi idaman kita bersama, neraca kekayaan negara secara keseluruhan gitu. Sinergi yang masih kurang atau yang perlu kita perbaiki dari setiap elemen tentunya menjadi kewajiban kita bersama untuk meningkatkan sinergi tersebut. Kurang lebihnya saya mohon maaf, waktu saya kembalikan ke Mbak Naris. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih banyak Bapak Hari Sutarmin, dan karena tadi sudah dipantun, maka izinkan saya untuk membalas. Kekayaan alam seperti cermin perlu dirawat dan diwariskan. Kepada seluruh panelis dan Bapak Hari Sutarmin, terima kasih banyak kami haturkan.
Woi, keren. Sudah bisa dikirim lomba pantun dunia nanti.
Ya baik, penutupan tadi menandakan selesainya acara diskusi dan juga presentasi. Maka selanjutnya kita akan mendengarkan penutup yang akan disampaikan oleh Bapak David Kacan, senior ekonomis dari Bank Dunia. Kepada Bapak David Kacan, waktu dan tempat kami persilakan.
Thank you, Naris. Thank you, everyone, and good morning. And it's really a pleasure to be part of this event and to have the chance to engage in this discussion. Unfortunately, I didn't prepare a poem. Thank you, Hari, for your words. I think that's a very nice way to end. And next time I'll try to bring something which is similarly as inspiring. But let me just make a few simple closing remarks here. 3 simple messages, things which I'm taking out of this discussion, and I think which will be useful as we go forward in terms of thinking about the most useful things that we can do in terms of a collaboration. So I guess my first point is simply that it's an honor and a privilege for the World Bank to be able to support the work you're doing. We've heard from Stephanie, we heard from Robert, that Indonesia is going in the right direction, an exciting direction. And we know that there has been something of a shift internationally. So we've seen the call from the UN Secretary General just in the last few weeks. We've seen the discussions coming out of the Dasgupta report. We've seen the discussions coming out of the T20 in Bali last year, which are now being continued. So the world is moving in this direction. And as we've heard, Indonesia is really at the forefront of that effort. So that's exciting, and it's exciting to be part of it. Secondly, it's really important to appreciate that this is just the start of this conversation, at least for us at the World Bank in supporting you here. I know you've been talking about it and working on it for a long time, but for us, this is a start and it's an introductory conversation. And I think what we need to do now is to think about which of the specific areas that we've discussed today would be most useful for us to dive in more deeply. And there's a few things that we can do, as we've discussed, Arik. We can help in terms of building that capacity to apply the established methods in the particular areas which are your focus areas. And in a minute, I'll show a slide where I suggest that we could dive in on particular valuation methods. So that's basically taking established methods and applying it to your priority areas, building your capacity. So that's one possibility. The second possibility is more what some of Stephanie's points were, which is there are frontier areas, new areas, ecosystem services, which are really at the frontier. And that's pushing the boundary in a methodological sense. That's another possibility. In other words, extending the boundary of what is measured. That's possibility 2. And then the third possibility, I think, is really exemplified by this event, and that is bringing us together, just engaging in the discussion, seeing the connections across ministries. I often find in Indonesia that the government is very advanced, but it's also very complicated. And so sometimes merely bringing the right people together ensures that a lot of good work happens, even without necessarily adding new technical details. So those are the 3 things that we can do. Let me just quickly share a slide, and this slide is what I will conclude on. The idea behind this slide is to put this a little bit into context. So today's event is not an isolated event. It's part of the conversations that we've been having, both with Pak Arik and his team, and also with our colleagues at the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. And there was a happy coincidence where colleagues at the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, led by Wakil Menteri Pak Alu, came to us and said, it's really important for Indonesia to measure the value of its natural assets, because that's how we can capture the value of our natural assets. And at the same time, Pak Arik and colleagues came to us and said a similar thing. We need to better measure the value of Indonesia's assets. And so we've had an event similar to this on conservation financing, which was starting the conversation on the MOEF side. Now we've been talking about natural capital valuation more on the MOF side. And what I see as a possibility is to really bring those pieces together. So we know that the data will come from MOEF. We know that the valuation will be done by Ministry of Finance, and we know that and BPS, of course. I think we need to add a logo in future, given what we've heard from Pak Puji. And institutions like BPDLH will be key in terms of realizing and capturing the values. It's one thing to measure value, it's another thing to be able to attract the capital which reflects those values. So in terms of where we go, we're proposing sessions which use some of the existing methods, the SEEA methods, for energy, forestry, and some of those other natural resources that Pak Puji mentioned, those not yet covered. So we could do some sessions for capacity building on those. We've been talking with our colleagues at Universitas Indonesia about sekolah valuasi, in other words, bringing that back for training on natural capital accounting methods and the INVEST tool in particular. And then going beyond the valuation and realizing, capturing those values, we'll continue to discuss with Ministry of Environment and Forestry, the development of conservation financing instrument. In other words, once we know what some of these values are, can we use that knowledge to extract new resources, perhaps through BPDLH? So I'll stop there, and I just want to thank once again everyone who spoke today, Stephanie and Rob. I want to thank our panelists, Pak Arik, Pak Puji, Pak Joko, Pak Hari for your moderation. It's been excellent. Our opening from Pak Dedi, also inspiring words. And a big thanks to my colleagues, Naris, Early, Mickey, and Danis, who have contributed to today's event. Looking forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Terima kasih banyak atas penutupannya Bapak David Kacan, dan kami juga mau mengaturkan terima kasih sebesar-besarnya atas kehadiran rekan-rekan dari Sabang sampai Merauke. Ini sepertinya kita banyak perwakilan dari Sumatera, tadi ada kemudian dari Kalimantan, dari Papua, dan dari Bali. Jadi terima kasih banyak atas partisipasi aktif dan antusiasmenya. Sungguh sebuah kehormatan seperti yang tadi Bapak David bilang untuk bisa sama-sama membantu pemerintah Indonesia. Nah, sebelum kita menutup acara hari ini, izinkan saya menyampaikan satu pantun terakhir. Boleh kalau mau disampaikan. Menteri Keuangan Ibu Mulyani.
Cakep.
Salat zuhur 4 rakaat. Sekian webinar Raca Sumber Daya Alam hari ini. Semoga materinya bermanfaat. Sekali lagi terima kasih.
Keren.
Shalom, Om Santi Santi Om, Nama Budaya, Salam Kebajikan.
Terima kasih Mbak Naris, terima kasih semuanya. Izin ya.
Terima kasih
Terima kasih Mbak Naris. Thank you David.
Terima kasih semua.
Terima kasih DJKN.
Terima kasih Bu Eci. Terima kasih.
Izin live ya.
Mari, silakan. Izin live juga.